Before the mountains were named, before the coasts wore harbors and quays, the land was already gathering its waters. To the north rose a wall of snow and stone that breathed cold upon the plains each year. From that wall, the Indus and its 5 swift daughters ran west and south, while the Ganga and Yamuna bent east toward a sea that warmed with long winds. Rains arrived on schedule and yet like a miracle, rolling out of the ocean between June and September, turning dust to growth and tautening the bowstring of life. Between these rivers stretched the wide fields where millet and barley took root, where cattle paths cut the grass in lattices, where the summer air smelled of clay and wet straw. To the west, beyond thorn and saltbush, the Thar waited with its heat and mirage, a stern watcher of caravans. To the south, ancient basalt rose into the Deccan, a step table of black soils that drank the monsoon like a vow. To the coasts the palms leaned and the surf spoke a language of oars, while in the forests that ran like dark rivers across the heartland, the hornbill and the tiger kept company with stone. Before cities, there were hearths under reed roofs and jars sunk into earth to keep grain cool, and the old knowledge that a seed returns if guarded from weevil and flood. People walked this ground as early as memory can be carried by bone and tool, and by the 6th millennium before the Common Era, cattle were bred with a careful hand, beads were rolled on simple spindles, and jars were smoothed with the patience of thunder. The habit of settlement grew, and along the banks of the upper Indus and its tributaries a craft of living took shape that would harden, brick by brick, into an order. By 3300 to 2600 BCE the riverland was schooling itself for cities. By 2600 to 1900 BCE the schooling ended and the cities stood fully formed, confident and exacting. This was the realm of well-laid streets and right angles measured by rope, of baked brick whose edge met edge without complaint, of drains that ran beneath the feet like a secret mirror of the avenues above. Mohenjo-daro sat with its citadel and its great bath, a rectangle of water framed in brick and bitumen, where the skin remembered the sacred chill of immersion. Harappa watched the long caravans of carts come and go, oxen steady under yokes carved with a sure hand. At Dolavira, the reservoirs were ledgers of rain. At Lothal the dock bit into the estuary and listened for the tide. Rakhigarhi held its silence like a seal jar. Weights were handled like silver rules, square and careful, each stone speaking the same language wherever trade was struck. Ivory needles, shell bangles, faience beads the color of cloudless noon, these passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, while potters' fingers read the clay as if it were a book the river had written. In those days the land learned how to name itself. A word rose out of water, Sindhu, the river that gave its sound to the people who lived along it and to the plains that drank it. Far travelers who sailed from the warm sea and the copper shores to the west, hearing the sound through other tongues, turned Sindhu into Indos and Indus, the name crossed on waves like a jar of perfume and returned on coins and tablets. But within, under the same sky, the land bore another name, older in the mouth and shining as the end of a firebrand, Brata, the realm held together by duty and descent, by song and road and plough. Sometimes the poets called the earth Jambudvar, imagining a fig tree that shaded the world. Sometimes they counted the rivers like bracelets around an arm and said Sapta Sindhu, 7 streams that braided and unbraided with the seasons. The people carried many tongues in their mouths. In the north, along the river plains where summer burned and winter was a clear blade, speech grew that loved compounds and thundered with verse. the language of hymns and kings and law. Its words were cousins, if one listened closely, to others beyond the mountains where horses ran thin and fast, where the steppe met sky without a seam. This kinship would declare itself in later centuries with the patient certainty of ink drying on palm leaf. Southward and eastward, amid the basalt and the coastal rains, another family of voices worked in cooler cadences, curling sound like smoke into long vowels and crisp stops, the tongues that would later sing of the red earth and the black rain and of love left as a garland on a threshold. In the thick forests and on the hill shoulders of the center, elder words endured, compact and bright as seeds, telling the old stories of honey hunters and iron's first bite, of stone bruised into blades and drums that could speak at night. Out of this chorus the future would braid its liturgy and its marketplaces, out of it law would be spoken, brides would be named, gods praised, debts counted, crops measured, and the dead sent on with the proper words at the proper hour. The cities along the Indus listened to the sea and answered. Boats with stitched planks and eyes painted on the prow nosed out of creeks when the monsoon winds tilted in their favor and rode the ocean roads to islands of palm and copper, to a gate of the west where scribes wrote on clay and kings reckoned their rains by harvest and flood. Carnelian beads drilled with a jewelless patience lay in jars on foreign tables. Bitumen and timber worked their way into ledgers scratched in a script of wedge and angle. It was between 2300 and 2000 BCE that these sea paths grew thick with exchange, when spices rode in baskets and cotton touched foreign skin as a new softness. On the inland roads, pack animals pressed the dust into memory, carrying lapis, steatite, chert blades that could shave a hair if you asked them to, and the clay tokens of account that promised weight and measure at journey's end. Inside the cities, order drew breath through the lungs of guild and household. The potters turned a meridian of clay each day, the metalworkers taught fire to behave like a servant, seal cutters sat with steatite in the light of a winter afternoon and carved tight emblems into its face, a bull with a front like a fortress, a strange unicorn leaning under a staff, a man between tigers with arms outflung as if mastering the wild. These seals carried a line of signs no one living then would have imagined as deserving loss. They pressed their messages into damp clay and left them to harden, certain, as all living cities are, that their meaning would run forward forever. Granaries kept their cool breath even when the sun beat as if it could smelt stone, wells were lined, thresholds were swept, corner altars smelled of smoke on certain mornings of the year. Children learned the shape of their neighborhood step by step. Old men could have walked the map of their city by memory with cloth tied across their eyes. Yet all cities are conversations with their rivers, and rivers sometimes cease to speak. Between 2000 and 1900 BCE the water changed its mind in certain channels, the monsoon weakened its drumbeat, tributaries that once laughed at drought slipped away like a guest who overstays and suddenly remembers another appointment. In the lands of the Gaga and Hakra, fields asked for a rain that came with less certainty, and caravans began to prefer other alignments of well and tree. The great Indus cities did not topple like kings on a chessboard but faded, the way a winter fire, untended, goes into ember and ash while still warm to the hand. Houses were left without quarrel, and new hamlets rose in other districts. The habits of town became the habits of village without oath or proclamation. The sea roads remained, but their cargo changed, the inland ways remained, but their stations multiplied and moved. What had been one kind of greatness became many small sorties, and the old stone weights were hung in new markets. In the centuries that followed, wheat and barley were joined by rice in the wetter east, iron would later bite into the earth with a stronger tooth, and settlements would run like a string of lanterns from the Punjab to the Ganga's middle course, pressing into the Doab where two rivers met like hands. But before that Iron Age, before the large towns returned, words took their throne. Between roughly 1500 and 1200 BCE, hymns were composed that sounded like horses at dawn and like water poured on sacred fire at dusk. They named the gods by their deeds rather than their faces: Indra, who broke the serpents of drought; Agni, who carried offerings to the high places; Varuna, whose noose was moral and whose law was wider than any river, and they taught the hearing ear to accept the world as order and desire intention. The singers preserved the meter as if it were a measuring cord laid on the ground of the mind. The hymns were not written yet but held in the vault of memory, transmitted like flame from one wick to another. Ritual polished the day, a man's duty could be weighed like grain, the seasons took on an ethical weight. Later, when farmers and herdsmen pressed deeper into the Ganga plain after 1000 BCE, assemblies would be called by drum and conch, clans would debate beneath banyans whose roots tasted the graves of their own elders, and law would become a thing one could cite in verse. Names multiplied with the growth of settlement. Janapadas, lands of peoples, took form east and west, their boundaries as much song as spear. The language of rule grew formal and sonorous, clipped for command and expansive for praise. The old, broad name Brata began to wear more precise garments, Kosala and Videha by the night-soaked rivers to the northeast, Kuru and Panchla along the paths where winter fog hangs like unspun cotton, Gandhara where hills bruise the sky and traders bring news before dawn, Avanti where the black soils lie under a summer hard as iron. Each region took to itself a way of eating and worship, a way of dressing hair and of pronouncing the same word for truth with a shade of difference. Southward, along the long fishbone spine of the western Ghats and on the red lands that breathe east to the bay, lineages tended memory with a different sweetness, and poets learned to ask rain to keep its appointment with the evening. The foreigners who reached the northwestern gates left their nicknames for the land behind them like visiting cards. As early as 600 BCE and before, the rumor of India's cotton and spices was abroad. By 400 BCE travelers spoke of elephants that moved like thought and of sages who could stand so still that birds mistook them for trees. But even when winds bore these stories past deserts and seas, the land was occupied first of all with itself, with sowing at the right moon, with the tying of wedding cords, with the rules for casting a net in a river swollen with yesterday's rain, with the training of a boy's tongue to speak without fault a verse older than his grandfather's grave. Within this daily weave, the first states were tightening their cords, and the first cities of the Ganga plain were taking shape in brick and light. The memory of the Indus, though, never left. In the west the old mounds baked under sun and starlight while goats grazed on their shoulders and potsherds glinted like fish scales after rain. Children found beads where a street had been, a farmer's plough rang against a length of fired brick that had once stood under the heel of a magistrate. When caravans crossed those fields they paced over a buried geometry, drains and platforms, courtyards and threshold stones, all asleep yet exact. Farther east, in new towns along the Ganga and in villages cut from sal forest, potters struck rims that remembered other rims, merchants counted with habits older than their own names, priests measured altars with cords whose lengths were scripture more than tool. Thus the land gathered to itself a double inheritance, the river-made order of the west whose brick lay folded under soil, and the hymn-made order of the north whose syllables lived on the living tongue. One was a memory of stone and drain, of weights and the steady hooves of oxen, the other, a memory of voice and vow, of sacrificial fire and the grammar of duty. Between them the monsoon continued to lay down its law, and the seasons rotated like a wheel. In this turning, men and women dreamed of sovereignty and of release, of empires yet unborn and of the solitude of hermits by silent tanks. Artisans dreamed of perfect joints and uncracked glaze, mothers dreamed of sons who would ride with kings or argue with poets, and the rivers dreamt only of the sea. The proof of their dreaming lay everywhere beneath a man's feet, in the jars that once held a household's hunger and hope, in the seals that flashed a man's sign across a threshold of clay, in the bracelets warmer than bone that circled a wrist now dust. Where the plough cut, it lifted sherds marked by fingertip and wheel. Where the mason sank a new well, he found the mouth of an old one. The ground itself kept a ledger, each layer a quiet page, and when a blade rang on buried brick or a child's hand closed upon a bead the color of sky, the page turned and a chapter began to breathe again. Their story, preserved not in chronicles but in earth and clay, lives on through the remains they left behind. The carnelian beads of the traders, the square stone weights of the markets, the brick-lined drains and the great bath, the seal of the formidable bull and the slender unicorn, these stand as silent witnesses to their beliefs and power. It is in these artifacts that we glimpse their world most vividly, bridging us from legend into the tangible record of archaeology. The earth opened first in small ways, a bead shining in a furrow, a brick that rang under a mattock, a seal that remembered a thumb. What had once been roof and court returned as lines of color in the soil, bands of ash, lenses of red where hearths had hardened clay into memory. Men traced the ghost of streets with a stick and felt the width of a lane in the resistance of the spade. Women rinsed a sherd in a pot of water and watched the slip bloom again like rain darkening a terrace. Whole neighborhoods rose from patience alone, walls that still held a corner's right angle, stair steps that kept their rhythm though the feet were gone, wells that stared up full of blue even after 3,000 years. The cities along the Indus had left their opinions in brick, the grid struck with rope and stake, houses laid to catch light and wind, drains that accepted a household's used water and sent it beneath the street with the curving discretion of a river taught to whisper. Latrines had floors tight as a closed fist, catpits rested like sober servants at the corner of every block, platforms for bathing still held their edge. At Mohenjo-daro the great bath waited in its rectangle, a hollow of coolness lined with bitumen, stairways descending as if into calm, while at Harappa broad halls stood in ranks of pillars where grain might have been measured, where accounts could be spoken aloud, where the city rehearsed its own order. The brick itself spoke of a mind that loved exact repeats. Its dimensions sang in ratio, a mason's hand would have found the old measure by touch even in the dark. In the west, at Dolavara, waterworks spread like a thought made visible, reservoirs wide and deep, stone-faced, receiving the rain that came certain months and released it to the thirst of other months, sluices and weirs managed both gift and restraint. On the coast at Lot Hal, the dock cut into the estuary where salt and sweet water quarreled and embraced, so that cargo could find a level place to change hands with the tide as broker. Warehouses laid out along the quay kept their bond with the sea in the shape of their doors. Across this world, weight sat in neat families, cubical stones and squares whose series climbed and descended like a ladder, allowing a man to promise 2 measures and deliver 1, or to prove to a doubter that his copper or grain had been weighed without trick. The city's small luxuries have not perished. Faience beads the color of afternoon sky lie in handfuls where a workshop once listened to a kill, carnelian, heated, etched, and cooled until it held the red of a ripened pomegranate seed, still threads itself into lines when a finder's palm extends. Shell from warm coasts travelled inland to be turned on lathes into bangles that could ring like thin bells. Ivory was cut fine enough to shame the breath, steatite softened under a knife until it admitted of seals whose faces packed animals and signs into the space of a fingernail. On them a humpbacked bull holds his ground, a unicorn leans under a staff like a standard of thought, a pipal tree swells its heart-shaped leaves above a pavilion of air. The line of marks above or below, short, tall, inflected with curves and angles, speaks a message we can only hear as music now. It ran obediently across wet clay whenever a trader's bundle was sealed, whenever an order needed a signature without speech. Toys have kept their grin, little carts with fixed rim wheels, clay whistles shaped as birds, chariots that remember the idea of swiftness though they never move again. Figurines of women with broad hips and fastened hair stand in their old composure, bulls tilt their heads as if to take a yoke, and dogs sit with the innocence of guardianship. On some floors the impressions of matting still remain. On some hearths a last scatter of char comes off on a fingertip and leaves a mark like a word. Tools rest where hands left them. Chert blades, struck fine from stone hauled out of a ridge that remembers the step of quarriers, lie by the dozens in little nests. Copper drills, capped once with abrasive grit, sit like promises near beads with holes bored neat as a priest's chant. A potter's wheel is gone, but the profile of his rim persists in the sherd, his way of finishing a lip, his favored thickness at the shoulder, the angle where a jar meets its base. Kilns preserved their own biographies in blackening and fracture. A misfired load tells the story of 1 week's mistake. In a few towns, squares of burnt earth, arranged with stern symmetry and pierced by a trench, suggest that fire was asked to behave according to rule an hour. Beneath those squares, the soil is fat with ash, altar or workshop or both, where daily life and holy rhythm took each other's measure. Beyond the deep cities of the West, other soils carry other archives. In central India, along the black-soiled plateaus, settlements left house platforms and bins that knew the weight of millet and pulse. Hearth circles of burnt clay keep the exact diameter of a cooking day. On the Malwa Plain and down the Tapi and Godavari lines, villages of the second millennium before the Common Era laid out their courtyards in light and shade, trimmed copper edges for sickles, set beads in hair, and sent their dead to ground with a pot or two, a blade or two, a last offering of cooked grain. In Rajasthan, among the dry rivers that still flash with memory after a good rain, people shaped Chalcolithic lives from 2000 to 1300 BCE, the ridge of a fort, the line of a drainage channel, the pattern of painted jars, red body, black design, that spoke in chevrons and loops. These are not the grand halls of the Indus but the confident grammar of household and hamlet. A shard of black and red where turns up like a standard here, its core dark where the firing had its will, its surface painted with a sure hand, it is the signature of many horizons. Eastward, at the margins of the broad rivers that draw fog over their shoulders in winter, early villages left post holes and brick like the bones of lighthouses. A floor of beaten clay can still be felt underfoot when the sun strikes right. A charred grain or two, rescued from a hearth, recalls a sowing in a certain season and a reaping before a certain rain. At Kai Rand on the Ganga's north bank, at Panda Raja Dibi where the old channels play with silt, communities tied their days to flood and recession as much as to calendar. The tools they used would have satisfied a hand in any century: a blade that takes the thumb's pressure, a pot that remembers soup, a bowl that fits a child's hunger, a net weight that holds the river's will in check. In the far south, where laterite burns red and the western Ghats climb tall under cloud, the earliest villages lit fires near ash mounds white as dry bone. Herds gathered and millets came in waves of little harvests. There, too, the earth keeps the scratch of a hut's footprint and the discipline of a cattle pen. Pottery preserves taste better than poem. When the villages grew numerous on the Ganga-Yamuna plain after 1200 to 1000 BCE, a particular ware rolled out on the wheel, grey at its heart, painted in thin lines so pale they seem like breath on a mirror. Bowls with straight sides and dishes with a high foot stood up in courtyard light, their surfaces tight and humming. This painted grey ware haunted the Doab from 1200 to 600 BCE, the table service of fields where iron was beginning to pay for itself and of towns that rehearsed the rites of assembly beside the obligations of the hearth. It does not pretend to luxury, it insists on fitness. Not long after, in the same plain and down the river to the east, another brilliant spread, a wafer-thin ceramic so well fired that it took a polish like a blade and lay in the hand with the thrill of stone. Northern black polished ware set its seal upon the centuries from about 700 to 200 BCE. It belonged to markets that expected tomorrow to be busier than today. It sat in the houses of men whose sons learned to count taxes and to write their names on a leaf taken from a palm. Ring wells came into service in those days, brick cylinders descending into dampness like hymns into memory. In towns with walls and gates, punch-marked silver began to pass quickly from palm to palm, stamped with emblems that needed no words to persuade trust. But long before silver clinked, the habit of burial had already taught the earth a language of endings. In the west, amid the last throbbing of the Indus cities, people lay their dead in cemeteries outside the old walls, supine, cradled by pots, accompanied by trinkets or by nothing at all. In the lands of the Sarasvati's former pride, jar burials took the hush of children. Elsewhere skulls found their own new homes after the flesh was gone and bones were arranged as if to play a last quiet game. Fire was a teacher and sometimes the last guest. In the Deccan's later centuries and in the south, history put on stones as if to be recognized by strangers, circles of upright slabs, dolmens with a porthole for the spirit, cairns that bellied under summer grass. Within these houses for a while lay urns painted black and red, iron tools as plain as a farmer's day, beads that tell of journeys by road and by tide. The megaliths rose between 1200 and 300 BCE, their silhouettes cutting the late sun. When rain ran over them, it cleaned their faces for the next generation to see and to wonder. Metal followed clay through all these changes like a shadow made of will. Copper and bronze cut, drilled, and adorned from the 3rd millennium onward, axes with a bite, harpoons with barbs honest as a thorn, razors curved like a new moon. In the 2nd and 1st millennia, iron learned the manners of temper and edge and entered the fields as plowshare and the kitchen as knife and the march as spearhead. A single bent nail, a clamp, a rivet, it takes so little metal to stand for a whole street of craft and duty. In workshops thick with the breathing of bellows, charcoal turned itself from silent wood to sorrowful ash while a bloom came to readiness and a hammer taught it the first rules of shape. Gold flashed in brief arguments with light in many places, beaten thin for ear and neck, hammered thick for the border of a garment. Along the coasts, pearls stitched their way through hair and trade together, and a coral bud from a far sea found its home on a woman's wrist. The script of the Indus kept its pride in silence. Carved into steatite and faience, painted on a pot's shoulder, scratched on a copper plate, it appears and is gone like a riddle. Later, when the age of empire spoke its laws in stone, other letters took the field, curving, clipped, brisk, but the old city hand along the Indus went to ground with its meanings intact. The habit of writing survived the habit of a particular sign. Men learned to cut letters deep enough to last a reign of centuries. They stood them up on lion-crowned shafts and let the sun read them aloud to the whole horizon. Stone and word came together finally as if to admit that each had needed the other all along. If one were to follow the trail of goods alone, a map would emerge as patient as a weaver's work. Carnelian moved from the heads of the Rann and the ovens of Gujarat onto boats that tasted both river and sea. Conch shells rode inland on a chain of barter whose links were forged in shade and smoke. Copper poured from mines like a slow, bright river. Timber came down, tree by tree, from mountains that spoke in pine and deodar. A block of lapis crossed from far beyond the northwest gates with the quiet of dawn. At ports that now sleep under silt and coconut, hordes of amphorae once knocked shoulders with bundles of pepper and bales of cloth. Pitchers of wine learned the names of unfamiliar thirsts, and glass from a western empire flashed strange in eastern light. Inland, a caravan's bell marked the day from ridge to ridge, and its dust braided the air over every market that had learned to count in more than one language of number. What we take for ornament the past often took for oath. A seal ring pressed into clay made a cask not merely closed but bound by someone's honor. A weight in hand transformed a barter into an equality recognized on both sides. A measure of cloth, done at the stretch of an arm and twice across the breadth of a palm, carried the whole world's practice of fairness as if sewn into its selvage. A coin, when it came, a bright leaf of silver beaten thin, kissed here and there with stamp and punch, traveled easily because it had no tongue. It represented the time of a farmer, the fire of a potter, the salt liquor herd needed in late dry season. The fee a boatman could ask for slipping through a channel filled with the crocodile's patience. In that way, economy and ritual and law shared a single bench under a shared shade tree at noon. Architecture never stood aloof from this traffic of measure and vow. The earliest fences of house and street obeyed a grammar older than any proclamation: keep the line true, set the door to take the morning, sink a well where the water lies and shape the opening to the bucket's smooth swing. Later, along the middle Ganga, walls climbed and grew angular, moats and embankments sharpened the edges of habitation, gates learned to count visitors and to stop them if the day were wrong. Brick turned to stone in places, and stone to brass and stone again. Timber beams supported roofs under which clerks rubbed ink and soldiers sharpened knives and priests rehearsed the hour. In the west, columns carved with animals that knew how to stand forever crowned the roads. In the east, ring wells and drains read the city's circulatory system with simple kindness. Even a pillar that never bore more than its own weight could be trusted to carry a thought. The makers themselves sometimes appear in what they left. A thumbprint in a brick, the impatient smear on a pot's lip, the crude line of a trial cut on a stone that did not wish to join a wall. These are the little signatures of mornings we can almost smell: damp when the kill was opened, ash in the hair. An argument about pay ended with a laugh when a friend walked past. A bangle maker's yard is a small apocalypse of shell, white shards like winter leaves, a drill's faint dust making a line under the table. The carver's bench has a runnel where filings flowed, the bead polisher's floor holds the twinkle that even sweeping mist. We stand where they stood because the air knows how to show a hand's work to another hand. Children in every age have placed stones in circles. In the south, where the megalithic habit grew tall, the stone circles watched crops drink the first storms, watched parched goats suck shade at noon, watched travelers take off sandals and seal their flasks and walk between the uprights with the silence of a place where somebody is listening. Beneath those circle stones, urns drowsed under years, iron lay with a brown skin that still smelt faintly of wet earth when woken, beads rested on ribs where they had rested on a throat. This language of burial, so earnest and so stubborn, belongs to a people who knew the value of an end and of a beginning, and who thought it wise to build with both. So the ledger of the subcontinent's matter is written in clay, stone, glass, shell, metal. Rivers wrote the first lines, fire added its gloss, human hands made their marginal notes. Across 13 centuries, from 2600 to 1300 BCE in the west, from 2000 to 1000 along the plateau, from 1200 to 200 across the Doab, the record grows fuller and then changes its hand. Where once the Indus grid made order like a law, later villages multiplied with the logic of fields and rains. Where once a single system of weights was a passport from city to city, later markets trusted other marks and other tongues. Where once seals spoke for men in an old short script, later letters would stand up in rows on stone and whisper of duty and mercy to passers-by who could read and to those who could not. Even the finest pottery yields to hunger and habit, polish rubs, rims chip, tall-footed dishes fall and shatter, are swept into a corner, and become the soil on which a new threshold is laid. And beneath these shifts, deeper than law and braver than craft, the pulse of water-made and unmade dominions. A river that fed a dock silts a harbor, a channel that kissed a city wall turns one day in its bed and wakes another bend with prosperity. The sky rations its wind and grants or withholds its rain as if testing the fidelity of plough and prayer. When the monsoon stepped back a pace in the second millennium before the Common Era, and when certain rivers loosened their grip and drifted apart, caravans sought other wells and villages chose new mounds. It was not the end of a people but the rearrangement of a breath. From ruins that never cursed their fate and from new foundations that never bragged, pathways formed that led north toward passes and south toward capes, east into fog and west into the high, dry light. Along those pathways words and cattle and customs traveled, along them men with new names for the gods arrived and married the daughters of the land. Along them iron came with its glint and its habit of asking more from the soil. The artifacts lie still, the footsteps are gone. But the direction of the footsteps remains in the alignment of wells and in the logic of a road's curve, pointing us onward into the stories of movement and pressure, of drought and surplus, of clans and kings and the long weather of change that drew the land toward new homelands, new assemblies, and new wars between 1500 and 600 BCE. The wind first carried people as it had carried seed, along the grooved backs of old river terraces and across the lower saddles where the high wall of mountains allowed a passage. They led cattle that lifted their heads to test new grasses, they yoked wagons whose wheels remembered a lighter country, and they spoke to fire as if it were an elder. Between about 1500 and 1200 BCE, the Northwest Plains felt the arrival and the stirring of clans who named the world in a meter that listened for hoofbeats. They came into a land already peopled by the children of older jars and older towns, by cultivators who could tell the sky's intention from the color of evening, by smiths who heard the pitch of a clean edge in the voice of the quenching water. The newcomers' horses took to the ground as if recognizing a cousin in the wide wind, their chariot-spoked wheels drew a thin keen line on the dust, and the songs that accompanied sacrifice and dawn began to braid themselves into the day's first business. Rivers, pastures, and fords became the alphabet of their movement. Lineage, named and renamed around a fire, was the grammar that kept the lines from breaking. The country they entered had already endured a long, slow rearrangement of water. In the centuries after 2000 BCE, the monsoon had stepped back a measured pace, certain channels failed to answer when called, and fields that had trusted a river's nearness felt the long hesitation between promise and gift. In the west, the Indus cities did not fall as walls fall but became memory without malice, their bricks turned to the foundations of other lives. Across the Punjab and down the Sarasvati's remembered course, villages gathered where wells were honest and soils listened to millet and barley and, eastward, to rice. In that landscape of moving edges, men who sang of Indra's thunder and the precise joy of Soma began to place their camps in loops of rivers that spoke to them like kin. They named the region Saptasindha for the braid of streams that offered both pasture and sanctity, they raised altars with measured cords, they treated the fire as messenger and judge. When they met the old people of the land, they fought them and married them, traded with them and ate their salt, debated with them under trees in winter fog and gave their children shared names that lay heavy and bright like brass. The hymns that kept their memory had dates woven into the turn of the year rather than scratched into stone. Still, the seasons point to time. Between 1500 and 1200 BCE, the earliest verses spoke primarily of swift cattle, bright dawns, and victory over enemies whose names were as much moral as geographic. Between 1200 and 1000 BCE, the songs lean harder toward settled ground, to the placing of the fire bricks in exact counts, to the ritual that tells grain where to stand and a king where to sit, to the geometry of the altar that mirrors the geometry of a village well laid. The clans, Puru, Bharata, Yadu, Tavasa, tested each other's strength at fords and on flats where the horizon does not lie, they boasted in verse, they apologized in verse, they made treaties by sharing cooked meat. A river called Sarasvati was still praised then, not only as water but as a goddess of speech. When her channel ran thin and turned away in the lower country, the memory of her name remained a full cup. The northwest, Gandhara with its stone shoulders, the doabs of the 5 rivers, was a school in which men learned the practical ethics of a plough and spear, and the magic of words that, properly placed, could ask the world to behave. Iron entered the scene like a modest god around 1000 to 800 BCE, quiet in its first favors and then suddenly everywhere. It turned scrub into field, widened the village, and bit roots that had once defeated wooden spade and bronze blade. Eastward, beyond the old confidence of the Punjab, the middle Ganga plain waited under forests that steamed after rain. Elephants walked there like slow thoughts. Soil, if opened, kept its fertility like a vow. Into that green hush the settlers came in bands that were no longer only wanderers. They carried hearth customs older than their own grandfathers. They cut timber. They taught rice to stand in water like a man in meditation. The years 1000 to 800 BCE see the Doab between Ganga and Yamuna dotted with village fires. After 800 and down towards 600 BCE, towns sprout like a sentence taking on clauses, citadels and outer wards, drains and ring wells, storehouses and shrines. Under the winter sun a clerk could warm his hands on a palm leaf while he counted a tax. In summer an elephant bathed where a ferry grounded its planks on sand white as a new pot. The old movement from meadow to meadow began to yield to the new movement from market to market. Their conflicts changed shape as their roads did. War at first favored speed and surprise, the chariot's arc and infantry running like a shadow at the vehicle's side. By 900 to 800 BCE, iron points made the peasant spear an argument a king had to answer with more than a song. Raids that once stole cattle turned into sieges that demanded walls and moats. One clan's right to a ford became a city's right to levy and license. At gatherings where a king poured libation and the priest measured the meter of a sacrifice, stern men with scarred wrists began to speak of boundaries as if they were laws rather than distances. The altars themselves declared permanence, laid out in bricks that could not be moved without offense to heaven. They set a center and asked a town to orbit around it. Even so, war kept its old ritual airs. Horses were still judged by the clean lift of the knee, the drum still declared hour and boldness, the flag still hardened the spine of a man who saw it standing when he feared it might have fallen. Movement did not end at the forest's edge. From the passes and the stony valleys where winter cuts the air into glass, traders and messengers came as regular as bad news. Before 700 BCE and after, lapis and tin and tails crossed the northwest gate. By 600 to 500 BCE the high kings of the western plateau, whose satraps counted taxes by the light of other laws, reached down their hands to feel the warmth of the Indus plains. Gandhara and Sindha learned to translate not only words but measures. Men who could sign a document in two scripts kept shops at road junctions under eaves where swallows nested. In the far west, a king in a city of palaces set an accountant to write the tribute from the east in a neat column. In Taxila a young man with ambition could hear 3 accents before he had his morning meal, one from a hill farmer paying for salt, one from a scribe trained beyond the passes, one from a priest preparing the day's first recitation. The land's movements were no longer only her own, they resonated with the stride of empires whose marches sounded from the Tigris to the Oxus. But the greater tide was internal, and its rhythm fell upon the middle Ganga. The old clans took new names for themselves as peoples of a place rather than peoples of a line. Janapadas, lands of a folk, took shape and staked out their silences and their noises. Kuru and Panchala along the upper rivers learned to speak in the voice of towns. Kosala and Videha eastward wrapped themselves in fog in winter and in mango blossom in summer. Farther downriver a pair of names, Magadha and Anga, began to walk with a heavy tread. Between about 800 and 600 BCE the habit of calling assemblies became regular enough to have furniture, a platform under a banyan, a circle of seats, the barrel full of water where hands were washed before judgment. Men who had been famous for their memory became famous for their opinions. A counselor's phrase could weigh more than a spear. The sub took its ease late into the evening. The samiti asked the broader town to give assent or withhold it. A king still boasted in ritual. but he had to count the heads who would follow him to a ford. He had to know what a guild would do if he treated it unjustly. Forests were enemies and allies. An army that set out from Kosala on a road that went bad after rain had to cut its way through bamboo that did not respect royalty. A caravan that took the late season and won its bet could sell the cloth on its ox carts for a rumour's worth of silver when it reached the river. Iron ate the forest and gave fields, fields gave taxes, taxes gave armies and the leisure of men to argue about what was right. Shrines rose in groves where animals had once paused and listened. Hermitages took shape near cold springs where the head clears after noon. Renouncers tested the worth of argument against the worth of silence. Between 700 and 600 BCE, a different tone entered the talk of the Ganga towns. One hears the dryness of men who have seen enough revenue to know the exact price of a lie, and the tenderness of men who have waited out a famine and learned where the city's kindness tends to fail and where it can be coaxed to hold. Legends traveled along with iron and tax rolls. They told of kings who expanded their glory by letting a horse wander and challenging anyone who dared to stop it. They told of sages who took apart a king's pride with questions sharp enough to draw blood and then sewed the wound with a verse. West of the Ganga's elbow, a prince claimed a victory at a crossing and had a priest call it a cosmogony. East of it, a king named Janaka sat on the ground to learn how to know the self and then stood up to govern a country as if the lesson had been about rice. South along the Namathos ladders of stone, traders kept alive a tale of a queen who held a market price by shaming a cheat with nothing more than patience. At the extreme northwest, men toasted the boldness of a youth who had descended from beyond the world's verge to ask questions in Taxila and to sell his answers in the courts of cities that heard 3 languages in their squares by midday. Even the animals that had stood as emblems of older times took on new tasks. The horse remained the proudest weight to be placed in a poem. The elephant, once only a dark swell glimpsed in the rain, marched under a platform that made arguments on a battlefield. Bulls still pulled a plough, but they now also proved a city's coinage by the steadiness with which they accepted their yokes in art and ordnance. The chariot, which had been the razor of combat, began to decline before the slow advantage of the soldier who could stand in a line and hold. The very shape of war adjusted itself to the geometry of towns. A siege demanded supplies and agreement, a march demanded roads and justice, a victory demanded scribes. The vocabulary of conquest changed from cattle taken to cities opened. An elder's authority had to instruct a young king in the novelty of governing people who could count and remember. The centuries between 700 and 600 BCE drew into a knot what had been threads. 16 great lands were named in one breath by men who loved numbers only when they could be remembered: Magadha and Kosala, Vatsa and Avanti, Kuru and Panchala, Gandhara on the stone road, Cambodia where the wind talks sharply, and others that put their weight on the map like stones set in a wall. Not all were monarchies. In the northwest and across the middle rivers, groups of clans stood together as confederacies whose pride was the council rather than the throne. A man could be elected to lead and then unseated if his hand grew too heavy. Towns held to their craft associations like a man holds to an oath. Guilds cut their seals and set their rules and endowed shrines where a lineage of merchants prayed for profit and for the forgiveness of profit's accidents. The world was now a room large enough that strangers could meet twice and not be surprised the second time. It was now a ledger thick enough to hide 2 kinds of truth on the same page. Pressure from outside did not cease, and in the last years of the 6th century before the Common Era, the weight from the west settled formally upon the northwest plains. Satraps marked the harvest, collectors wrote tallies in a script fit for high plateaus, men from Gandhara called out weights and measures in more than one language without dropping a grain. From about 520 to 480 BCE, the empire of the far-off king laid a fingertip on the Indus and felt its pulse. Tribute went north and west, and a road was kept so well that a traveler could predict his next night's shelter by noon. Out of that touch came habits, of coinage regular as a heartbeat, of policy that measured as much as it commanded, of a notion that a land could be considered one even if its foods and skies were different in the mornings and the evenings. When the heavy hand lifted, it left behind, among other things, the idea that a central order could be felt at a distance. Still, the most decisive migration was inward, from clan to kingdom, from vow to law, from altar to court. By 600 BCE the Doab could stage a fair that drew merchants from 3 horizons. By 550 BCE a king of the Middle Ganga could think of eating from plates polished enough to catch his face and of sending a taxman who would not be murdered before the ford. Everything that mattered, grain, men, beasts, words, moved in patterns that could now be taught to a son as a lesson rather than suffered as a surprise. With that regularity came the wish to state things plainly and to bind them. A man wanted to know what he could own and how to defend it. A woman wanted to know what her dowry meant to the elders who remembered an older custom. A guild wanted written rules to shield its apprentices from the tantrums of a lord. A king wanted a hierarchy that could be inherited like a riverbank rather than gained anew like a battlefield. The land, therefore, bent toward form. In courts that smelled of ghee and sweat and ink, ministers sketched hierarchies on the waxed boards where they also sketched revenue schedules. Judges rehearsed precedents and listened for the clear ring of a fair decision. Priests explained which ritual minor kings could claim and which they could not. Heralds learned to name not only a lineage but an office. The language of duty, dharma, began to stretch from the fire's rim to the market's edge. It tried to say what a warrior owes to peace and what a merchant owes to truth, what a wife deserves from a husband who claims to be just and what a king may take without being called a thief. Varna as a scheme of order gained a sharper profile in speech and ceremony. Those who learn and teach, those who rule and protect, those who till and trade, those who serve and craft, each with dignity in the mouth and tension in the hand. The map grew dense with obligations, and the song that once followed a herd now followed a calendar. Thus the era of moving peoples and changing waters passed naturally into the era of settled institutions and named powers. The chariot's track became the street's curb, the oath sworn at a ford became the decree posted at the gate, the elders' circle under the banyan became the king's hall with benches of wood and bronze. Councils learned to speak with one voice, kings learned when not to speak at all, guilds learned to say we in a way that could own a temple. In that atmosphere of order and its discontents, between roughly 600 and 400 BCE, the land taught itself how to be governed. It seated assemblies called by drums and conches, it crowned men whose foreheads were smeared with the ash of sacrifices, it spared and punished in balance, and it measured its days by taxes, feasts, and campaigns. From these manners of living together, the sabhā where hard questions were asked, the samiti where consent was sought, the king's chamber where orders were sealed, rose the structures that would bear the weight of empire and monastic renunciation alike. Their shape now waits to be told in the language of offices and councils, of law and custom, of crowns that sit lightly or press too hard. Power first gathered where talk could be made to sit still. In the villages of the Doab and the towns that took shape after 700 BCE, men carried benches out beneath banyan shade and brought their disputes to a circle whose diameter was exactly the length a voice can travel without strain. There the sabhā, the council of elders, spoke slowly and without fear of silence, and the samiti, the broader assembly, assented with a murmur like rain over leaves. A king in those days had to be as patient with words as with wounds. He learned to wait while a man told the long path of his grievance from seed time to threshing floor, while a guild master recited a list of oaths sworn by his craft, while a negotiator reminded all present of the tax that had been promised at a ford in a previous famine. Authority wore bark and ghee and bronze at once. It was a mixture of custom and command, of the remembered example and the announced decree. It reached its right hand toward ritual to legitimize, its left hand toward grain to endure. The body of rule had bones now. Officers were named with care, a keeper of the city gates, who counted men and wagons at dawn and again at dusk, a master of granaries, who chalked weights on clay and listened for the tone of fairness inside a measure, a collector of the Levi who knew that a kingdom that takes too much from a village eats its own seed. A judge wrote on a palm leaf how a boundary stone had been moved by night and restored by public shame. A messenger ran 14 miles with his waist bound tight and his head covered against dust to deliver peace or a date for war. In such towns the night watch called the hours with a drum, dogs barked at their passing, and even at the darkest time of year a lamp burned before the goddess of the crossroad so that a widow could cross home unafraid. Markets were set on particular days, the toll house smoked with the steady business of counting and of letting pass. Guilds, set rules for apprentices, kept a chest for charity, fined members who shaved a measure or cheated a widow, endowed a shrine where the god received flowers bought with honest profit. A city, once no more than a place where paths crossed, became a book where streets were the lines and taxes the punctuation and the law the grammar of every act. Varna was spoken of then as one speaks of a carefully made wheel, a hub of learning, a rim of service, spokes of rule and trade joining necessity into motion. Those who tended fire and text guarded the memory of the words that shaped duty, those who bore arms kept safe the roads that harvest and marriage and mourning had to travel, those who steered plough and shop made the food and fashioned the fittings of life, those whose hands remained closest to earth and water did the unglamorous tasks that keep the day from stalling. In practice it was more muddy than a poem. The potter's son could be found with a spear in his hand when the ford had to be held. A warrior's wife might own a loom whose cloth paid a tax that fed a temple. A learned man might lend on interest and then explain the righteousness of contracts with a line of verse. Yet the scheme allowed a vocabulary of mutual obligation and a way to call a wrong by its correct name. The rites of passage that marked a life, naming, thread, marriage, cremation, gave each person a place to stand in the crowd, household law and town law and king's law braided into a cable that could pull a nation across bad years. Kingdoms took their shapes with the forthrightness of a field staked with new ploughs. 16 were named in verse around 600 to 500 BCE, but for leaned forward more heavily upon the age, Kosala with its orchards and its winter fog, Vatsa with its river trade, Avanti straddling the old roads that ran through the black soils and up toward the stone-chested west, and Magadha, whose alluvial stomach could feed armies and whose forests yielded timber enough to palisade a city and to build 100 boats. Names grew under names, Kashi put sharp taxes on cloth. Videha sent thinkers back into the world after teaching them to go beyond it. Cambodia and Gandhara kept the high passes honest. Anga felt the salt of the sea after rain. Some of these were monarchies stocked with the usual troubles: ambition, succession, the lies of a chamberlain, the impatience of young princes, but others were confederacies of clans, Ghana Sangers, whose pride was the assembly and whose law rode out on horseback with the elected chief and could be replaced when it soured. Vaishali in the north shone as a boast of collective rule in the 5th century before the Common Era. There the Likavis and their allies kept their roads swept and their archives bound, sent envoys with straight backs and clear eyes, and rang the bell of consultation before a campaign. In their council hall, where Matt smelt of reed and the hour was marked by the slant of light along the wall, a speaker stood with a staff and yielded it when he had said enough. No one pretended an assembly made men angels, factions chafed and families jockeyed, and sometimes a vote was settled by who had eaten better that morning. Yet the habit of consent made a different wind blow between the houses. A farmer who had been heard about the spillway of a tank was a farmer who would fight to hold a wall. The pride of the republics lay not in a single man's name but in the road he had paved and the water he had husbanded and the steadiness of the prices in their markets. Magadha, meanwhile, observed and gathered. Between c. 546 and 493 BCE, Bimbisara in Rajagriha tied his fortunes to the roads by marriage and by treaty, and clipped a few enemies' wings by the old method of steady pressure. His son Ajatashatru, c. 492 to 460 BCE, built machines that threw stones, drew moats as deep as argument, and brought the Vajji Confederacy to heel after long campaigns that taught the plain about siege and patience. Farther west, Kosala under Prasenajit played policy like a game of Go, placing corners, testing edges, content to let time soften a rival's grip. In Avanti, Pradyota watched both north and south, willing to taste war or marriage as the day required. None of these men could rest easy. A road can carry a friend as swiftly as an enemy, and a coin promises rebellion as eloquently as it promises trade. The century turned. Around 400 to 350 BCE, in the kingdom's backrooms where scribes kept tallies and soldiers counted scars, a new intensity took hold. Revenue was scheduled, not begged. The levy was assessed by surveyors who measured a field by pace and cord. Irrigation tanks were lined with stone and endowed with rules like any temple. Ferries had hours, bridges had inspectors, fines were graduated with the elegance of a poem's meter. Guild charters were copied and countersigned. City wards kept lists of strangers who had lodged with them. Patrols walked the night not as a favor but as an office. Spies, as patient as owls and as shameless as crows, listened in courtyards and in stables and at wine cellars' doors for talk that smelled of treachery. Punishments found a grammar, a thief repaid with interest, a false witness wore the heat of public contempt, a violent man was broken by a fine that pulled his pride out by the roots and fed it to a public work. Mercy had its rules, too: amnesties on feast days, tax remissions after flood or drought, the right of a supplicant to grasp the footstool without being beaten for it. The king grew more visible without becoming more reachable. The state became a building whose doors had hours and whose counters had clerks. A hard, bright change came with the Nandas in the late 4th century before the Common Era. They gathered Magadha's strength as if rolling a coil, copper to silver to gold, Taxes came with a new promptness, hordes were stacked where only the most trusted eyes could measure them. A standing army ate as much as it defended but terrified rivals with its simple fact. The talk in bazaars said that under Mahapadma, old lineages had been humbled like weeds under a mattock, and the entire valley of the Ganga had been made to listen to a single voice. Such talk exaggerates what it admires or fears, but the shape it sketches is true enough. By c. 325 BCE the Middle Plains were disciplined by one will. The palisades at Pataliputra shone with fresh-cut timber, the moat reflected the sky like an omen, an offender could measure his peril by how far the messenger had already run. Then came a conqueror born of hunger and taught by reverses to trust his anger less than his patience. Around 322 BCE, Chandragupta seized the engine of Magadha and turned it outward along the roads that led north and west and south. He stitched a realm together with garrisons and with gifts, with marriages, and with the careful humiliation of those who needed to be reminded what was possible. He faced a Western lord whose soldiers wore bronze and linen and who commanded cities that tasted of wine and stone. He fought, parleyed, and divided the world between them with an agreement that exchanged elephants for quiet. By c. 300 BCE the broad north lay under a single umbrella of law, from the slopes of the Himalaya where bees drank rhododendron to the mouths of the Indus where the sea salted the wind. Collectors made their rounds on good roads and reported to men who reported to other men who reported to one. The capital at Pataliputra sat like a raft at the bend of the sun and the Ganga, a long straight city of timber and trench. Its palisade carried watchtowers that counted the hours with shadows, its gates took fees in coin that had passed through 15 hands since dawn, its council chamber rested on pillars whose stone showed animals that knew how to hold still for 1,000 years. Streets ran straight as reason, drains were covered but accessible. Inspectors of weights could appear anywhere a scale hung and make a merchant empty a sack if his measures rang dull. Post houses kept fresh horses and hot water, milestones told a traveler how long until the next well, rest houses offered a cot and a bowl of rice and a place to hear news. Across the empire governors sat like patient spiders, and the silk they produced was report. A revolt in a hill district, a fever among cattle, a surge of banditry near a forest, a shrine that drew pilgrims and coin enough to tempt theft. The center answered with grain, with justice, with a road cutting, with a garrison, with a new temple roof and a guard for its chest. Bindusara, c. 297 to 273 BCE, kept the machine oiled and pointed it toward the Deccan. Men who had eaten only river fish learned to smell the sea on two coasts. Toll houses counted spices whose names felt new in the mouth. Then Ashoka, c. 268 to 232 BCE, took the seat and tested the empire's temper. In 261 BCE his armies went east and south against Kalinga, where the beaches are wide and the rice grows in paddies that shine like mirrors under the monsoon. The land was taken at a cost that even a victor's knight could not ignore. What followed was not weakness but a different sort of strength. The pillars rose, polished and straight, lions at their crowns like the guardians of a promise, and on their faces words were cut that taught kindness with the simplicity a market can recognize. He appointed officers to care for travelers and for animals and for prisoners. He asked vassals to value restraint. He forbade certain cruelties not because they weakened his hold but because they made the hand that held unworthy of the task. The empire's roads thus carried not only troops and taxes and salt but also a policy that tried to make mercy run as predictably as a courier. Law under such weight learned to breathe evenly. Disputes were first offered to the smallest possible circle, household, ward, guild, then raised to the city bench, and only then to the governor's court. Testimony had standing according to character and proximity, a written contract tied two parties and the god before whom it had been witnessed. Marriage bound not just man and woman but two houses. Dowry flowed with conditions that all knew but many argued. Inheritance balanced the claims of sons and the provisions due to daughters and to those who had no sons at all. In many districts, a community held land in long strip plots whose width remembered floods no living person had seen. A canal had a schedule as sacred as a rite. A watchman's staff shadowed the harvest where birds tested the courage of boys. When famine threatened, granaries were opened by rule rather than by whim. When plague came, ferries were outrun by fear, but the gates kept their hours so that a city would not die of panic as well as disease. The republics did not disappear under imperial shade. In the northwest, lineages of riders kept their assemblies alive by meeting in the same valleys where the wind teaches the voice to carry. They sent fleece and horses and a duty of men in exchange for space to remain themselves. In the hills between the plains, smaller polities made alliances that outlasted three governors. A clan's stubbornness could be a virtue when the empire needed a frontier watched. Even in the heartland a city could trot out its pride. A guild lent to the crown at a moment of stress and expected to be repaid in privileges that would stand until somebody brave enough, or foolish enough, tested them. Thus the empire was at once a canopy and a net, a protection and an inconvenience. It counted what it could not reach and tolerated what did not threaten the roads. When the long hand finally loosened after 232 BCE, when grandsons and courtiers and generals and provincial ambitions took turns at the levers, the machine did not immediately break, it slowed. The Yugas in the north, c. 185 to 73 BCE, held a kernel, their vigor martial and their taste for horses obvious. The canvas flickered after them. In the Deccan the Stavhanas, c. 1st century BCE, 2nd century CE, learned to govern river by river with markets at the bends, stitching the plateau to two seas with caravans and ports. In the west, men who kept their hair and beards differently and wrote in a hand more angular set up satrapies that managed trade and minted silver with a clarity that pleased merchants. In the far northwest, Greeks trousered for the cold and Indians wrapped for the dust took turns naming the same cities and praying at each other's shrines without embarrassment. In every case, the old virtues argued for themselves anew: roads, weights, guilds, the impartiality of the law in petty things, the proud usefulness of a well. Courts everywhere adopted the same few postures. A king seated on a low lion-legged bench listened while a plaintiff told his story, a scribe scratched, a clerk recited analogous cases, a priest remarked upon the duty owed by the strong to the weak and by the weak to the truth. Outside that hall something more substantial than posture held the town together. The neighborhood headman who could silence an argument without humiliating a man, the guild warden who could quiet a price war, the temple treasurer who paid for road repair before the rains, the officer who inspected the city drains without making them an opportunity for a bribe, the village watch who knew the names of the dogs and of the thieves. Across centuries from 600 BCE to 200 CE and beyond, such offices endured like stones in a river. Water washed them, moss grew, boys leaped from them into coolness, and yet they remained. Even far from capitals, power wore the look of order. A caravanserai at the edge of a salt plain kept a fire pit, a shelf of bowls, and a rule that a last traveler would not be turned away. A frontier garrison posted notices about the penalties for stealing a horse and the reward for informing on a band of raiders. A small port on the western coast moved its market day by decree to match the moon because the fishers swore by tides rather than by sun. Somewhere a judge refused to hear a case on a feast day and the city loved him for it. Somewhere a governor forgave an arrears after a flood and the village swore him eternal loyalty until his successor took it back. A mature polity is made of such frictions and such accommodations, and the subcontinent wore its maturity as a cloth with many borders, each border a story about who lived inside it and who was asked to wait outside. Beneath the instruments of government lay the customs that no decree could afford to break. A guest's right to a cup of water at a door at noon, the cow's right to be led round the village after calving, the artisan's right to be paid in the coin agreed even if the master found fault with a finish that had been in fashion last season, the widow's right to lament without being hurried, the poor's right to sit on the temple's outer steps in the shade while the rich passed by with their offerings. Such rights were not always honored, and when they were not, anger learned to move its feet toward the council place. But the very existence of the memory of fairness is the state's daily salvation. So the social body and the political body grew together, from clan to council, from council to city, from city to crown. The calendar's rituals gave a pulse to law, law gave rhythm to wealth, wealth bought ornaments for gods and benches for assemblies, the gods in turn lent their witness to contracts and their silence to forgiveness. In such a world, truth needed forms to live in, and forms needed truth to avoid becoming only masks. The same hands that stamped a coin pressed flowers, and the same mouth that pronounced a sentence pronounced a blessing, the same square that hosted a punishment hosted a procession. Those who kept the fire in the heart of a house blessed the king who kept the roads, those who counted the king's taxes prayed that their own sons would learn the chant correctly, for the line between rule and right was a line of breath, not a wall. From that shared breath came questions sharper than spears. If duty rules the city, what rules the heart? If a kingdom demands obedience, what does the soul owe to itself? The Hydaspes benches could hold a lawsuit, a tax code, a treaty, but men and women began to want a bench that could hold sorrow and fear and the itch for release. Into the noise of markets and the calm of city tanks entered voices that spoke a different grammar, voices that taught of a law beyond edict, of a liberation beyond victory, of a compassion that did not ask the name or the tax status of the sufferer. Monks in saffron walked lanes where assessors had walked, asking for alms and offering a doctrine. Naked ascetics slept on the earth a governor had ordered paved, testing whether a man is stronger when he carries nothing. Kings found themselves listening, merchants found themselves endowing monasteries as readily as shrines, householders added a new merit to the ledger with their gifts. The pillars that carried law began also to carry counsel, the caves that once hid bandits took on paintings of quiet teaching, the very coin that paid a fine funded a meal for a renunciant. Thus the forms of governance, solid and exact, opened a door in their own wall and faced east into the light of renunciation and inquiry, into the rites that feed the gods and the disciplines that seek the self beyond gods, into the stupas that hold a memory and the fires that carry a prayer. They had built benches for law and halls for command, but the land asked to be governed by breath as well as by ordinance. Fires were steadied in courtyards at dawn when 600 to 400 BCE taught towns to speak with a single voice, yet the oldest authority still rose from flame itself, from a rite whose geometry was older than any court. At a household's heart 3 fires were kept as 3 understandings, one round like the earth that bears, one square like the altar that asks, one half-moon like the gift that returns. Agni answered all 3 faces without confusion. His body took ghee and grain and carried words upward as if smoke and meaning were one. Men who had learned to count taxes by 550 BCE also learned again to count bricks, the 5-layered altar for a wish, the falcon-shaped altar for a reach beyond strength, the hearth that tied a marriage's first meal to the sun's daily journey. When a chant named Indra, it did so with the bowel-deep certainty of a warrior calling for a gate to be opened. When it named Vayuna, it did so as one who knows debt and the goose-flesh of oath-breaking. When it named Soma, it did so as a man who has watched a monsoon lift a river and felt a joy too strict for laughter. The rite made a prince into a king, a field into a precinct, an intention into a vow. A man might govern a city by decree in the afternoon. He governed his own heart at dawn by pouring milk and watching it take on light. Between 1500 and 1000 BCE the hymn masters coaxed a world into couplets and quatrains. Between 800 and 500 BCE a whisper under the chant gathered itself into sentences that refused to stay within the measure. The teachers went to the forest edges where the wind combs the leaves and breath can be heard. There they sat on grass that had been cut with a blade as clean as a conscience and said what the city could not hear without trembling, that there is a self which is not body nor breath nor mind, that speech can circle it and never touch it, that to know it is to know a quiet larger than victory. These sentences learn to wear parable as armor, a salt dole that walks into the sea and does not return, a drum whose sound depends on emptiness at its center, a firebrand that writes a circle in the night only for the eye to mistake the circle for anything but the speed of a point. Around 700 to 500 BCE, fathers taught sons that duty and inheritance were a right angle. At the same time men and women heard from these forest porches that knowledge and release are a curve. Renouncers began to walk the same roads as tax collectors. Naked ascetics slept under the same stars as caravan guards. Men who had shaved their heads to humility stood at the same ferry as men who had oiled their hair for office. The discipline of not harming hardened into a vow that could make even eating a negotiation with time. Silence took on the weight of confession. Fasting became a grammar for speaking without error. In that age, when 6th to 5th century BCE castles were being squared and canals lined, a prince in the east took off his ornaments and put on a robe the color of a fallen leaf. He sat at a tree root in 528 or thereabout and listened until he could hear his own fear go still. He taught then with a scale of compassion that men had forgotten could be walked. The first turning of the wheel was heard at a deer park where the light lies level and a man's shadow behaves. He asked his hearers to look at fire and name it clinging, to look at thirst and not flatter it as love, to look at hatred and see it as a hand held point first against oneself. He spoke of a path with 8 planks solid enough for a man to cross the flood without grabbing for weeds. He founded no army, only a company of beggars who carried bowls that made every house in a city able to say, at least once that day, the sentence I gave. In the same generation a man of iron vows, born perhaps around 540 to 500 BCE, taught men to hold harmlessness until it gleamed like diamond. he asked them to own truth as if it were a tool and to keep themselves as light as a bird from the weight of possession. If they took off their clothes, it was not for display but to make every season into instruction. If they kept silence, it was because the last lie in a man is lodged deepest in his tongue. Guilds that once endowed only a shrine now raised a hall for discourse. Merchants whose ledgers were exact funded monasteries where the afternoon was measured by a bell and the evening by a lamp lit to kindness. In the mid-3rd century BCE, when a king in the wide north sat on a throne whose wood still smelt of sap, he looked upon a beach where corpses lay thick after his victory and felt the weight of triumph like a stone on his chest. From 261 BCE forward his pillars rose, lions looked out under open sky, the sentences he had learned in remorse were cut into a clarity that neither rain nor the hand of malice could erase. He taught non-killing as a policy that respected the appetite of a soldier for honor without respecting his appetite for cruelty. He taught the worth of all sects not as a royal fad but as a carpenter's plumb line for peace. He ordered trees and wells to be placed along the roads, instructed his officers to look to prisoners as to fellow mortals, and gave even animals a place in a king's consideration. The word he favored for his ethic traveled as easily as a grain of salt, dhamma, and a traveler who could not read could still stand under a lion and feel what the stone was saying. Caves that had once served wind and goats were made into places where doctrine knows how to sleep and wake without losing its shape. In the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries BCE, on hills whose flanks ring like bronze when struck, halls were carved that keep the cool of darkness like a secret. There a monk could sit in the rains and let his mind settle like silt in still water. A century and more later, painters in those hollows would set the life of compassion into walls where pilgrims could read with their eyes alone. But even in the beginning the chisels had already said the world can be simplified into kindness, that an arch can be asked to sing, that stone can learn manners from breath. Out on the plains, domes rose over relics with the logic of a hill refined by a builder's patience. At sites where roads cross and evening lamps gather moths, mounded earth and brick became a grammar for memory, and a rail of carved stone taught a crowd how to circle without jostling. The old gods did not vanish, they put on new profundities. Rudra, wild as uncultivated weather in earlier hymns, learned to sit, to bless, to dance the truth that creation and destruction share a single ankle bell. He became the Lord who wears ash because all form is tinder and who allows himself to be bound by love because the world needs a model of surrender. Vishnu, once a stride-taker through the 3 worlds, learned a gentler vocabulary. He lay upon the serpent of time and dreamed creation without pride. He took on shapes to right imbalances that pride had set loose. Lion man, dwarf who asked only for 3 steps, prince whose bow sang against injustice, dark cowherd whose flute gathered the lost. The goddess who had stood as river and soil found her tongues, as speech and as learning, as motherhood and as terrible protection, as beauty that is a path and as strength that is a wall. Village shrines smoked with clarified butter where these presences were addressed under different names. City temples founded in timber and brick made a frame around them when the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE pressed wealth into offering. Later, when the 4th to 6th centuries CE discovered stone with a new courtesy, the sanctum learned to hold a darkness relieved by a single flame. And a tower rose to tell the sky that men below had chosen their image of heaven. Funeral was a gate, not a terminus. In the north where the Ganga and Yamuna teach the dust its place, a man's body was given to fire with the accuracy of love, bones gathered next day, still warm to the touch of grief, were carried to water and surrendered back to the river that had given grain, fish, and road. Names were spoken so that they would learn the habit of being remembered. Rice balls fed the dead on their way as a narrative of gratitude. The house remained quiet for the right count of days, and then the fire was fed again so that life could resume under discipline. Where burial had older rites, on the plateaus and to the south, the urn took the bones into its round patience. Stone set up as a village of the dead taught cattle path and pilgrim both that the living must step gently where another breath has been. In all places, a last gift accompanied a last look, a cloth, a bead, a coin for the ferryman whether or not he took fees, a handful of earth from a threshold because no traveller should go far without home. Festivals threaded the calendar with rope of joy. In months when heat leans hard on the land, water was thrown as if to rehearse the monsoon. In months when the monsoon lay heavy, lamps were lit as if to rehearse dawn. When harvest came in, an image of a god was born to a tank and immerse so that abundance would not be hoarded into drought. Drums taught the feet to remember old stories. Conches announced the hour to a city before the sun did. A procession allowed the poor to walk beside the rich without asking permission for the day. These rites were not mere noise. They taught law its humility and courage its proportion. They loosened grief where grief had hardened. They reminded a king that the bow is an instrument for silence as much as for harm. The aims of life were stated with a clarity a merchant could admire. Around the turn of the era, men named 4 pursuits and laid them upon a single palm: duty, which is the grammar of coexistence; wealth, which furnishes the household and funds generosity; desire, which honors the body without allowing it to rule; and release, which answers the soul's old homesickness. Householder and monk stood like 2 tall trees on the same bank, their roots drinking from the same water. Asceticism without kindness was warned against as cruelty in disguise, indulgence without law as a slow suicide. The stages of life were suggested as a way to move a man safely through power: student when obedience is still soft, householder when giving governs taking, forest dweller when detachment graduates from wish to habit, renouncer when the last tether can be untied without scaring those who still need ties. In this way a town could honor the king and the beggar in one morning without tearing its own cloth. The law of sacrifice itself changed its diet. Where once a right's success was measured by the strength of the smell and the fullness of the gift, a later age taught that intention weighs more than offering and that compassion can substitute for precision if precision cannot be had without injury. When 300 to 200 BCE cities fed 100 households every noon, an argument rose in the markets and the monasteries about whether generosity is better than meditation and whether meditation without generosity is a rootless plant. The land answered as it usually does, with plurality. In one street the smoke of meat, a king's consecration whose grandeur declares 2 years of preparation and a season of feasting; in the next, the uncompromising kitchen of a teacher who will not take life for palate or for text; in the next, a guild's free kitchen where rice is scooped with the same ladle for all, because profit that does not wash itself in public becomes an odor that clings. Symbols learned the discipline of steel. A banner, once just an animal painted on cloth, became an oath when it was fixed to a pole and raised above a company. The eagle promised swiftness and the heat of sunlight, the bull promised patience and irresistible weight, the trident promised that the world's 3 strands, creation, preservation, dissolution, could be held by one hand. The discus promised that law, when thrown, returns with red on it because justice is not a decoration. Mantras were bound to weapons as if sound could teach iron to remember why it had been smelted, bows were named like suns, swords slept on stands with flowers at their feet. A conch taken from the sea learned to frighten not by its note alone but by what it had come to represent. A city's will not to be moved without debate, a king's habit of consulting a council before he ordered a gate closed, a troop's confidence that in the morning they would be fed whether or not the night had been kind. Even mercy armed itself with instruments. In the 2nd century BCE and onward, monasteries kept registers of the poor who could be relied on to sweep the court and be fed in return. Shrines kept lists of widows to be invited when lamps were lit. Merchants founded clinics for beasts of burden whose knees had been used up by too many seasons of salt and grain. A city that can care for animals announces to enemies that it can also care for wounded men. A town whose monks teach boys to read a slate announces to spies that messages will be read more quickly than before. Thus the gentle arts, arising from doctrine, reached long into the day of force and did not dislike themselves for it. In the South, where red earth remembers every footstep with affection, poets built a theology out of love and war together. The god was a hero with sweat at his temples and tenderness at his mouth, the goddess a queen whose glance could steady a line of infantry, the devotee a friend who knew when to joke and when to hold his peace. Pilgrimage learned to follow rivers, capes, and hilltops. Praise learned to hold a place name like a jewel and turn it in the light so that it flashed differently on each syllable. What began around the early centuries of our era as song would later instruct empires, but already by 100 BCE the 100 CE drums of devotion set men's hands on the haft more steadily and loosened those same hands at dusk. What held all this together was a single courtesy, that truth be given a body to live in. The body could be fire properly laid and fed, it could be a rule of non-harm elaborated until even a thought learned to tread softly, it could be a stupor that gathered grief into wholeness, it could be a temple whose darkness was chosen, not an accident, it could be a law carved in stone by a penitent king, it could be a poem that stills lust without scolding it. The land took each of these bodies into itself as a city takes immigrants who arrive with craft and discipline. Under their combined gaze, even violence had to introduce itself, to say by what right it entered the court. Yet enter it did. A king's consecration requires a guard, a road that serves pilgrims also bears troops, a banner with a god upon it cannot remain only art when a fort is watched from it. Priests who bless harvest bless campaigns, monks who reject killing reconcile soldiers and teach them how to carry scars, ascetics who praise silence stand on a wall and stare down rioters until commotion forgets its words. In every age the conch that calls men to prayer can call them to formation, the drum that marks festival can mark the pace of a march, the fire that consumes a funeral pyre can harden iron at a forge and give bite to spear and sword. The land therefore turned its face without shame to the next question, how men who honor gods and renounce cruelty must yet take up bow and blade, how an elephant learns the law of a battlefield, how a chariot becomes the sentence that decides an argument no other grammar can settle, how fear is used as a tool and not as a master, and how a warrior walks away from victory with his humanity still his own. War rose as a duty when duty alone could not hold a boundary. A bow unstrung is still a promise, and men in the Doab and along the 5 rivers learn to keep that promise with reed and bamboo and the tempering of sinew. A string pulled to the ear makes a note that is both music and measurement, and arrows flew with heads of copper first and iron later, their fletching whispering the same lesson to every season. Spears began as walking staves and became laws in a man's hand. Shields were woven from hide and wood and learned to turn aside the argument of steel without insulting it. In the older age, when the hoofbeat could still outshout a town's wall, the chariot was a thunderbolt on two circles of light. Between 1200 and 900 BCE, horses ran in teams under bits that tasted of bronze, axle end sang, and the frame, alight as a sentence cut to the bone, carried an archer whose arrows braided air into death. Oath and right were harnessed to this craft. The horse set free in a king's consecration told neighbors the same thing aboard a stone told strangers, that a claim had been made and would be tested. Camps flared up along river loops where the ground was solid. Dawn saw ghee thrown to the fire and the day's first string drawn taut. Dusk saw wounds washed cool and the names of the dead folded into the memory of a clan. Iron asked for different geometries. By 900 to 700 BCE, lines of men on foot learned to stand like a fence in flood, spears planted, shields shouldered. They taught the chariot how to grow old. Cavalry, leaner and less ceremonial than the chariot's dance, found its openings wherever the plain lay honest and the field had been stripped, on wooded ground and by the broken country where streams frayer march into misery. Infantry made the new grammar of victory. The fourfold army took its seat in the mind, elephants whose shoulders moved like hills at walking speed, chariots that still hunted flanks where pride was careless, cavalry that carried decision at a gallop, infantry that held and took and held again. Officers learned to think in fours the way a builder thinks in right angles. Camps were palisaded, trenches were thrown, garrisons learned the taste of months, arsenals breathed like steady fires through winter and the rains. A king who knew his trade kept spies on the road and inspectors in the forges. He enrolled villages by quotas and remembered, if he were wise, that a Levi that steals seed is a victory that turns into famine. The elephant, which had been a rumor in the mist and a danger in the cane, became the empire's breath drawn to a point. Captured in Kedars where courage and cunning made a funnel of the forest, separated from herd and loneliness, taught to trust a single voice, he was turned from a habit of tearing trees to a habit of pushing men. A cloth of mail hung like a river over his shoulders, bells announced his stride, and a tower, no more than a box with low walls, gave archers a height the enemy could feel in his stomach. He smelt horses with a contempt that could tilt a campaign. He feared fire with a clarity that could ruin his own side unless the mahouts goad and word held. He died hard and taught men who watched him that wait can be brave. At Hydaspes in 326 BCE, when the rains had raised the river and the pebbles rolled underfoot like marbles, a king from the west slipped a part of his army across a dark bend at night and met a prince whose elephant stood like a palisade that breathed. The melee was a music of old and new, phalanx pressing forward like a wall that walks, horse archers worrying flanks like dogs, elephants throwing darts of panic with every scream and every step. It ended in respect, because a man who commands such animals and does not let them shame him at the end is a man who understands gravity, and in coins that remembered an elephant on one face and a foreign name on the other, as if to admit that for a morning the world had been one field. Not long after, far to the east where the Daya River meets the sea under a low, hot sky, war told a king what victory costs. In 261 BCE the roads leading into Kalinga were salted with sweat and with fear, the beaches were stamped with a confusion of footprints, the paddies flickered like broken mirrors under the monsoon, and the streets of a conquered city lay heavy with bodies that had been alive before noon. The man who had ordered this looked upon it and discovered that strength can choke on its own meal. What followed the grief was not the disarming of a realm but the arming of a conscience. Pillars rose where milestones would have sufficed, lions doubled as witnesses, edicts told officers to prefer restraint to cleverness and told men with swords that economy of death was the only form of thrift that makes a state last. Yet the army was not dismantled, it was disciplined to carry not only steel but policy. Elephants still learned their paces, garrisons still kept the long watch, but heralds cut a different set of sentences into stone and set trees and wells along the roads to remind a kingdom that the point of holding a country is that people may move through it alive. Enemies did not fail to present themselves. In the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, men with saddle habits born in other winds rode in from the northwest under names that tasted of stone and grass, soccers from the steppe, Greeks wearing trousers for the cold, Parthians with an archer's shrug, and they brought with them the art of the swift circle and the backward shot, the metal that turns a rider's chest into a wall, the discipline of feigned flight. The answer to such questions is always a learning. Indian lines thickened their shields, their cavalry took to composite bows and to spears held low and unromantic, their elephants were kept back until a field had been prepared for their weight. Forts at passes became schools of patience, towns learned to be not only markets but magazines, treaties war dates measured not only by moons but by campaigning seasons. In the 1st and 2nd centuries of our era, when the Kushans gathered a kingdom out of riverheads and caravan ends, cataphracts that wore their horses like a second skin clashed with infantry that had paid in taxes for the privilege of being well led, and the result was a frontier that held because both sides had learned to respect the office of a wall. The South made its own music of war. In the centuries around 100 BCE, 200 CE, the red earth of the Tamil country drank the vows of kings whose drums were named and whose spears had genealogies. Banners showed boars and tigers that were not drawn to frighten children but to remind men of history. Chariots in the south traveled roads where palms make a sound like rain even when the sky is clear. Cavalry kicked up dust that tasted of salt because the sea stands close. Infantry ran in sandals whose straps remembered both field and deck. Ports were gates and also prizes. A fleet could turn a king's pride to tarnish in a tide. A levee built for a paddy could be a wall when the day was unkind. The war the South liked best was the one it could finish before the festival, but when it needed to, it fought on and marked the years by the spears hung in the temple like petitions that had been answered. Siege is the argument most cities would rather defer, but the age brought it to many gates. Engines that hurled stones with a slow dignity flattened the courage of men who had not met them before. Rams covered with wet hides made conversation with a wall intimate and cruel. Towers creaked forward under sheets of rawhide that steamed when the defenders' oil found them, and sappers worked by night with the patience of men who know that earth, if asked properly, will betray any friend. Water decided as often as will, a canal cut in secret, a dike broken at the hour when the moon's pool does most work, a cistern poisoned by a hand that had been deemed honest. At Rajagriha in the 5th century before the Common Era, the arts of the attack were tried against the arts of the defense until one was found wanting. At towns whose names the rivers have forgotten, the same contest was held without witnesses, and the walls fell and were rebuilt without the world needing to be told. War taught men to speak with instruments. The conch at dawn, one note that gathers the city into a single breath, learned to call ranks to attention. The drum that tells feet how to keep time in a procession told them also how to keep fear company without bowing to it. the banner became a sentence visible from far away, a bull that promised weight, a Garuda that promised swiftness and skies on our side, a trident that promised that creation, maintenance, and ending could be turned in one wrist. Armor was not only leather and mail, it was also words spoken over a blade and a pattern of ash on a forehead. It was a vow shared among men who would see each other in the last hour and wanted to be able to lift their eyes. Mercy sought its place even here. Prisoners were counted rather than guessed at, ransoms were made a tax rather than a theft. The wounded of both sides learned the difference between a soldier's hatred and a butcher's appetite. After battle, purification was not an affectation but the state's way of telling its killers that the killing is over for the day. Logistics, an ugly word in a poet's mouth, was the poetry of survival. Grain moves slower than rumor and faster than regret. An army that eats well thinks well. Ox carts cut grooves into the earth that outlive the men who loaded them. Roads laid to move tax and message were roads that moved troops and plunder. Ferries that served weddings and pilgrimages served regiments. Fords that had been the pride of a village became the prize of a campaign. The season chose half the war's outcome. The monsoon made fields syrup and walls green. It gave fever to an army that had not learned the manners of wet, and it hid both ambush and retreat in its pale sheets. Dry months made dust into a second enemy and thirst into a commander sterner than any general. Marches began at night and ended at noon. Wells were rings of iron as much as of water. Sages could write of virtue, quartermasters wrote the day's truth. Weapons were a dialogue between craft and desire. Boughs of cane and horn that grew in the hand like proper tools, short swords that learned to be quick rather than grand, spearheads that wanted only a competent arm, later, mail that could be mended without leaving a lie in its links, helmets that allowed hearing because a deaf soldier is a dead one. Standards in coinage made payment regular enough that men could sell risk for a calculable price. Depots of fodder and piles of cane kept the elephants from turning on their own. Blacksmiths knew the taste of charcoal on the tongue and the relief of a quench that sings correct. A single campaign might drink a province's surplus, a new fort might eat a forest, a victory might pay for a bridge that 10 years later saved a village from a flood. War was the most expensive way a state could educate itself, and it sent bills in many scripts, to farmers for grain, to herders for oxen, to merchants for carts and loans, to guilds for nails and bolts and bowstrings, to ports for rope and tar and the hiring of men who knew tides by their smell. Terror was used carefully when it was used well. A head on a spike rots too fast to be a lasting policy. A burnt village becomes a lie in a king's mouth when he speaks of mercy. A massacre is a lesson that teaches the wrong students. Reputation was the longer blade, that Magadha pays promptly, that the Satavahana roads are safe, that the men of the northwest will harry a retreat until you are ashamed of your own back, that a certain king keeps his word even when it hurts, that another takes hostages and loses them to his own cruelty. A state's face at the frontier was its officer's face at the gate. One smile at a toll house saved more campaigns than any speech at a consecration. In such a country, fear and trust were weighed like silver on the same scale and both were subject to the same inspection weights. The sea did not stand outside this economy of force. Ships rode out of creeks where jackals drink at night and into channels where dolphins curse and bless with equal indifference. They carried men with bows and jars of water, and their oars beat time learned from drums ashore. A fleet at an estuary could starve a rival king quicker than 6 months of maneuver inland. a cutter could run down a grain boat in the dark and make a year lean for 1,000 strangers, a port kept a boom not only for storms but for war. Yet the same hull that could be filled with soldiers could be filled with pepper, the same rope that moored a galley moored a merchantman, the same sea that saw quarrel saw profit. Every admiral learned the trader's calendar, and every trader learned the admiral's mind. When battle had been paid for and won and the dead given back to their elements, the city turned at once to healing the breach that war necessarily opens in the order of life. The smith counted what had been bent and broken and made a list. The potter filled orders for water jars because thirst does not wait for politics. The carpenter replaced a bridge plank that had unseen cracks. The guild that had lent to the crown collected its interest in privileges, market sites, exemptions, a right to police its own. And a shrine received a new bell or a new flag because men who have survived want to say thank you in the language their hands know. The treasury weighed out coin for arrears. The assessor revised land rolls because a field's owner might now be a widow. The road warden swept grit from milestones. A banyan that had been cut to clear a line of fire left a stump where a vendor set up a stall. War is the ruin of stability, but it is also an excuse to measure it, and from those measurements came the deeper knowledge of how wealth is made and kept, seed bought at the right month, water governed by fair schedule, interest that does not gut, weight that does not lie, a port that knows the wind's habits, a caravan that knows which well has a bitter taste after a storm. The clangor of iron and the roar of elephants therefore fade into the clink of coin and the creak of cart wheels. The banner that frightened a wall becomes a sail, the general's map becomes a trader's, the courier's road becomes the artery of a market. From the discipline that war forced upon men grew the softer, broader discipline of exchange, fields under rule, guilds in their dignity, ships set to the monsoon, pepper and cotton moving like seasons, and it is into that quieter yet larger theatre that the story now must walk. Commerce replaced the drum with the abacus but kept the drum's sense of time. After 600 BCE, when councils grew regular and roads received their milestones, the land learned to make a season pay for itself. Rain from June to September fattened the rice plains east of the Doab, winter wheat and barley held the west steady, pulses stitched nitrogen back into fields so that a plough could turn without guilt. Tanks were cut on slopes where granite remembers thunder, buns were thrown on black cotton soils that crack like old lips in April, spillways were measured in hands and in omens. In Magadha and Kosala, after 550 to 450 BCE, the village headman read the canal's schedule as if it were scripture. In the Deccan, by 300 to 100 BCE, farmers married the tank and the monsoon into a treaty that kept the paddy's ankles wet without drowning its heart. In the far south, where the red earth takes footprints like promises, bund fields widened under kings who preferred irrigation to rhetoric. By c. 100 to 200 CE, a stone barrage across a patient river turned flood into calendar and made a granary the equal of a garrison. Grain is the first coin. A sheaf stacked under a thatch is a sword taken from fate and given to tomorrow. Villages tithed in kind where coin had not yet learned all its manners, elsewhere the silver leaf of payment, flat, punched, marked with little suns and trees and beasts, passed from palm to palm with the quiet authority that only a scale can confer. Between c. 500 and 200 BCE, punch-marked money clinked in the stalls of Varanasi and Ujjaini, in the ferry towns of the Yamuna and the low streets where Taxila tilts toward winter sun. Weight sat in families of stone as neat as a merchant's sons, and measures were policed like borders. The same officer who could break a cheating rod before a crowd could also lift his eyes to praise a guild that kept its word through famine. In the cities, said this, bankers with hands that smelled faintly of ink and sesame oil, took deposits from guilds, financed caravans, stood surety for ferries, and taught a new trick to distance, a sealed order that could be turned into silver 2 market days away without the risk of a robber's moon. Road stitched the continent like palm leaf cord. The northern route, the great road of the upper country, ran from the stone school of Taxila, where winters draw the breath short, to the long raft of Pataliputra, where the sun and the Ganga make a marriage worth watching, and eastward still toward the damp ports where salt comes to the city first as rumor and later as taste. The southern road learned other names and other heats, from the Ganga elbow west to Avanti, down past the black soils that drink storms without bragging, over to the Godavari and along to Pratishana, then farther to the sea markets where masts make a little forest even when no wind moves. Ash-grey mileposts remembered emperors, rest houses kept beds like simple altars and jars of water covered against dust, wells were planted like trees at proper intervals, after sea. 260 to 230 BCE stone pillars, smooth as a promise kept, told a traveller in a language of curves and angles that mercy was also law. Caravans made of 30 ox carts snored by night, bells on lead yokes rang in a rhythm that became a lullaby to guards whose ears were trained to wake for any note that did not belong. Guilds gave these roads their cargo. The weavershre in Kossi dyed cotton until it held colors that did not surrender to sweat, bleachers in the salt sun made white that could shame a cloud. At Ujjaini, metalworkers beat plates that could roof a shrine or a hull, coppersmiths shaped pots that made boiling a sacrament of cleanliness. At Taxila the ivory carver's bench held dust as fine as a trader's conscience. In the south along the Bhavani and the Kaveri by 200 to 100 BCE, bead-makers cored carnelian with a patience more durable than stone. The red seeds of that craft ran north by cart and east by boat. In the east, in Vonga's damp, muslin grew thin as a rumor and strong as truth, a cloth that could pass through a ring and still keep out cold if laid properly. Guild charters were copied onto copper and palm as if to teach durability 2 languages. Their donations cut on cave walls and stupa rails prove that profit prefers to be remembered as piety once the ledger is closed. Ports were the mouths of this economy, and the sea a second river. On the western coast, where the monsoon steps ashore with a firm foot, creeks learned the shape of hulls and boys learned to smell wind. Brukukacha, Baragaza as foreigners said, took the Namadho's gift and turned it into trade. Sapara farther north whispered of old voyages even in the sleepiest age. South along the palms the harbours of the pepper country kept their black granules dry and their accounts drier. By the 1st century before and after the Common Era, ships out of the Red Sea learned to trust the ocean's seasonal breath, that great southwesterly that rises in June like a decree and the northeast that answers it after harvest, and they came to the Malabar with amphorae of wine and jars of glass, with copper and coral and coin stamped with the brows of far kings. They left with pepper and long cinnamon-scented leaves, with cardamom that makes a mouth tell truth, with ivory that's still. Remembered forest shade, with cotton that made legionaries reconsider the weight of their wool. In Kerala's low lagoons, at a market that liked to change its name as tides and tongues required, foreign tongues bought cargo by measure and by mood. In the nets around Korkai in the far south, pearls were lifted from the throat of the sea by men whose breath was a religion and whose wages were weighed before a goddess who accepted only fairness. The eastern shore kept its own diaries. Tamralipti, where River Silt writes a new map after every flood, sent boats out to the ports of the Cloud Islands and the Golden Lands. The bay made a corridor where monsoon and current agree to be helpful for a time and murderous at other times. Down the coast from the mouth of the Ganga to the lagoons of the lower Kaveri, fishermen who could read a line of foam better than a line of palm leaf taught merchants the manners of shoals. From those harbors, rice moved out with the patience of the poor and returned as metal and story. The Andhras, between Godavari and Krishna, found that a man who controls a river's lower miles controls a century, by c. 50 BCE, 200 CE, their cities funded halls with pillars and courts with clerks, and their coin, copper for daily sweat, silver for the conversations of the great, walked along both shores of the peninsula without needing an introduction. The northwest stayed a gate and a lens. Horses came down the stony valleys with frost in their manes, taller and angrier than the country's own. Their price could be a lawsuit if an inspector felt cheated, a war if a king felt tricked. Tin, lapis, and fables crossed the Oxus and the Ravi together. Tax farmers on the frontier learned to accept standard weights in more than one script. In the first centuries of our era, cataphracts paid for fodder with silver that shone like ideas. The same track that brought riders brought silk thin as an eyelid and strong as a bowstring. Under Kanishk's time, c. 127 to 150 CE, the Old North Road thickened with quilts, sutras, and the shapely speech of men who had stood at 3 thrones without kneeling. Every market is a school of law. A ferry toll cannot be taken twice without a riot. A measure with a hollow foot will make a city ashamed of itself. A guild that refuses to feed its apprentices in a lean month will find, 2 years later, that its secrets have leaked into alleys with worse morals. In the centuries 300 to 100 BCE, as cities multiplied, charters nailed to doors and rules carved in cave porches taught a young merchant the right way to lie and never about weight, the right way to boast, only of punctuality, and the right way to pray, with a coin in the left hand and humility in the right. Interest found its ethics, cruel in bad reigns and bearable under good. Pledges were taken with witnesses whose names were worth more than signatures. Warehouse receipts took the place of sleeping in the dockyard on a sack of pepper when winter rains made the cold into law. In mixed towns where 2 scripts shared a street, contracts were bilingual on principle, and a magistrate who could hear a case in either tongue confirmed by his very patience that profit and justice are not enemies. The countryside did not go hungry while cities grew rich. Villages kept seed grain in jars sunk to their shoulders in cool floors. Granaries at the edge of towns knew how to open after a flood without inviting theft. Sharecropping arranged in winter stood through summer if both sides kept their tongues civil. Taxes took their share, on land and on movement, at gates and at bridges, and were called justice only if the king's roads were passable and his courts faster than rumour. A ruler who forgot to clean the city drains before the first rain of June discovered that money can rot. 2. A governor who repaired a tank's bund after a breach in year 134 of a local count found his name spoken more fondly than if he had built a shrine. Women managed the granary ledger in many houses. Their hands remembered both dowry and emergency, and their math could shame a lazy collector. In good years surplus turned into copper jewelry and new rafters, in bad, into loans forgiven because tomorrow's crop would judge today's hardness. What the land sent out it also made at home. Spices gave forests a wage, teak gave hulls that did not complain, sandalwood scented both marriage and death. Iron came out of laterite breasts and learned to be steel with a temper that sang when struck. By the first centuries of our era, southward furnaces birthed bright ingots that traveled as far as envy dared, their edges later made into blades that remembered the hammer's rhythm. Salt walked on bullock back from pans where the sun did most of the work, fish were dried on mats and walked inland until rivers allowed themselves to be rivers again. The poor economy of brooms, pots, sandals, and oil kept the great economy from looking like theft. A city that fed its sweepers lasted longer than a city that paved its streets without paying for dignity. Ships taught men to count in horizons. Hulls stitched with coir walked the swells with a faith that does not feel like rashness when the star one trust steps out on time. By c. 50 to 150 CE, captains out of Muziris and Nelsinda and the lesser creeks wore rings stamped with foreign heads, not because they loved other kings but because those rings bought repairs in distant yards. They sailed when the sou'wester had begun to smell of rain, they returned when the northeast dried the welt of the world, their oars learned to be silent when wind kept its word. Ports paid for pilots the way a palace pays for physicians, a mouth that knows a shoal is a state asset. At the quay, amphorae with bitumen bellies banged shoulders with jars of ghee, beads, pepper, and rice took their turns under scales that had the right to be satisfied. Coins multiplied their languages as swiftly as gods do. Punch-marked silver yielded in the 2nd century before the Common Era to issues with faces that could be recognized by a child, copper cast for the market and silver struck for the respectable purse taught the palm to expect regularity. In the West, in the time of men with square letters and straight beards, drams poured like a small river and then withdrew. Their children in nickel and billion outlived a generation of tax collectors. In the 1st and 2nd centuries of our era, gold with a foreign boast in Latin or in Greek fell into jars in the south and the west and even in the middle river towns. It became anklets, then temple bells, then endowments for kitchens that fed pilgrims at noon. Money is a shapeshifter, and the land learned to make its changes serve. The city was a chorus, fishmongers whose calls smell before they sound, potters who throw before dawn because the wheel has its own cool hour, oilmen whose presses groan like slow beasts, beetle sellers whose leaves shine like a waylaid officer's boots, money changers whose tables are the speed of trade made visible, scribes who sit where the shade discovers them. In the lanes of Mathura by c. 100 BCE, 100 CE, stonecutters stood shoulder to shoulder teaching red sandstone to obey breath. In Bharat and Sankai earlier, railings learned to carry stories the way a road carries men. In Vidisha and Amaravati a relief could hold an entire voyage in the curve of a single sail. Guilds paid for such work with a pride that was almost shyness. Donors asked that their mother's name be cut as carefully as their own, and a man with only a half coin could ask that half to stand in stone for him because intention is currency when recorded publicly. Not all profit smelled of spices and coin. Knowledge is a commodity that moves by memory. A verse that sets a contract straight outlives 3 caravans. A parable that keeps a king from folly is a wealth greater than salt. In the centuries that saw ships grow bold, 100 BCE, 200 CE, theatres learned to time the laugh and the lament with professional cruelty. Grammar took shape under minds that disliked sloppiness the way a weaver dislikes a loose weft. Treatises found their lists because cities taught men that a list saves lives. Music counted beats as carefully as a caravan counts wells, the hand gestures of dance remembered treaties and betrayals more faithfully than a clerk. All these arts were borne on the shoulders of stored grain and safe roads and honest scales. From the northwest gate to the pearl farms of the southeast, the country discovered that wealth is a chorus of small honesty conducted by large order. The conch that once called a levy now called a fare, the banner that threatened an enemy now promised a discount to pilgrims, the elephant that had learned to stand in battle now learned to turn a mill with steadiness when floods bit off a city's bread. The state found that the surest tax was goodwill, the surest savings a clean drain, the surest prosperity a port where strangers come twice. When famine pinched, endowments opened, when plague knocked, the guild kitchens boiled, when a flood took a harvest, the road crews had work the very week the waters fell. Wealth put on faces, a bell that sounds right, a pillar that stands plumb, a copperplate charter that reads as clearly to a grandson as to the signatory's hand. Thus the long arithmetic of rain and road, guild and grain, river and sail paid for a new grammar of beauty. Patrons who had counted bales began to count syllables, merchants who had taught stone to float began to teach stone to sing, kings who had ruled weights asked sculptors to weigh grace, guilds that had endowed kitchens endowed theatres and pillars and painted caves. Prosperity asked for images to live in, for songs to measure it without boasting, for buildings to turn gratitude into shade. The chisel that once cut a tax edict now cut a lotus and a lion, the brush that once marked bales now learned to follow the curve of an eyelid, the drum that timed a march now timed a dance. From workshop, granary, harbour, and hall the city carried its surplus to the threshold of art, and the hand that had balanced account and cargo now reached for balance in line and colour and word, opening the door into a chamber where story and stone, rhythm and ritual would take up the wealth of centuries and transform it into forms that could outlast coin and cargo alike. Wealth asked for forms to inhabit, and forms arrived as if they had been waiting just outside the door. Grain stored in cool jars made time for hands to practice grace, safe roads brought strangers whose tastes challenged local pride, steady coin taught proportion to the eye. In town after town between 300 and 100 BCE, railings went up around mounded memory, their crossbars carved with wheels and vines, gateways learned to bend a beam into a curve that could invite a whole city to walk softly. At Bharat and then at Sankai the stone itself told stories in low relief, the birth of a prince under a sal, the generosity of a king who had nothing left but his resolve, the ship listing under a press of cargo and hope, and the crowd reading those stories learned to read themselves. Yakshas stood with bellies like granaries and smiles like full wells, Yakshis leaned against tree trunks that flowered under their touch, teaching in the language of hips and anklets that abundance is a virtue when ordered by fairness. Farther west, polished pillars topped by lions faced the wind without blinking and spoke in letters whose curve held authority without shouting. The eye could follow a line of script along a stone and feel the same rest one felt in shade at noon. The old epics came to their fuller voices as if summoned by these new surfaces. Between c. 400 BCE and 200 CE the great tale of cousins arguing over land and duty thickened and braided, its battlefield a field of the mind as well as of dust. A charioteer's counsel found its permanent home in verses that a householder could keep under his tongue as protection against pride and despair. A little later or earlier by region, the story of a prince in exile walking the length of a forest to find the shape of justice in love took on a cadence that villages could sing while shelling pulses. A bridge laid to an island became, in memory, a bridge laid to the heart. In the south between roughly 300 BCE and 300 CE, poets laid out love and war on two clean tables, interior longing and exterior contest, and wrote of red earth after rain, of bracelets slipping on a wrist grown thin with waiting, of drums that call a city to defend its tanks. In market Sanskrit and in the softer Prakrits that carry laughter more easily, drama took a stage, a director with a garland explained beginnings to the audience, a hero entered with the last daylight on his shoulder, a heroine took the plot in her hand like a lamp, and a clown told the truth without penalty. By the 4th to 5th century CE, verse found a craftsman whose images moved like swans across a tank at evening, and a play could hold rain and remorse in the same scene without wasting a syllable. Speech itself was harnessed like an elephant. Students in stone schools at the Northwest Gate and in river towns learned a grammar whose rules fit together as snugly as brick, a net so fine that a word could not slip unless allowed. Meter put reins on thought, the four aims of life, duty, wealth, desire, release, became the four corners of every major poem and every household's calendar. Treatises mapped the theater's space, where curtains and drums created worlds. Manuals taught how to weigh a gesture so that a lifted eyebrow could speak louder than a paragraph. Chanting schools held the old hymns in a tone that the body could remember when the mind strayed. The Vedic melodies, polished through generations, trained throats to ride breath with exactitude. In halls where oil lamps trembled at the least draught, strings and flutes and drums, a long-armed lute, a reed that could make a courtyard weep, a barrel drum whose palms spoke in proverbs, worked out a grammar of sound that could accompany learning, love, and law with equal respect. Sculpture learned two dialects for the same devotion. In the northwest from the 1st century BCE to the 3rd CE, where winter grief sharpened stone, draperies fell in folds that remembered another sea's wind, lips and lids learned a calm that had crossed passes, the man of compassion stood with a weight balance between presence and withdrawal, and on the friezes around him the figures of old mountains and Greek vines kept each other company without insult. In Mathura's warmth across the same centuries, shoulders broadened and torsos breathed like hills, and the smile on a face admitted the town's air and dust. Bodhisattvas and early lords of preservation and destruction shared pedestals with Nagas and tree goddesses, a linga under garland smelled of ghee, and a four-armed guardian held conch and discus as if they were ideas visible to the hand. A little later, when the 5th century taught stone to behave with a new courtesy, a seated teacher with downcast eyes took on a tenderness that could fill a room. Reliefs of boar and man-lion announced that justice sometimes arrives with claws only to put them away once the balance is restored. On a hill not far from a river bend in c. 401 CE, a king's pick struck a rock, and a god emerged with a third eye that has seen enough to grant and to withhold. The cliff became a proclamation in the language of sinew. Caves on basalt shoulders turned into halls where silence learned to sing. From the late 3rd century BCE, in valleys where a sudden shout brings birds to air like prayer flags, arches were carved that remembered real beams but preferred stone. A horseshoe window poured light along a nave to a stupa that kept a memory roll tight as a seed. Monks ate rice, read, and kept still through the rains. Donors carved their names along the verandas so that the world would remember that wealth, used correctly, creates coolness for others. By the 2nd century BCE and again from the 5th century CE onward, painters wrapped these hollows in color, a prince in blue considering departure, a queen's hand on a latticed window, elephants dreaming of lotus ponds they had never seen, laying a skin of story over the stone's bone. In other hills, markets paid for caves where merchants could hear doctrines about cause and compassion between trading days. Pillars left slight bulges at their middles to correct the eye's mischievous appetite for curvature, and ceilings remembered the grain of timber even after the chisel had taught them to forget. Temples found their first roofs in timber and brick, then asked stone for permanence. Along the middle rivers in the early centuries CE, shrines learned to distinguish an inner square from a public forecourt. Circumambulation turned from a habit around a mound to a deliberate embrace of a sanctum. In time a tower rose over the core, telling the plains that a heart beats within. Doors bit deep into jambs to hold guardians with serpent shoulders. Lintels carried rivers as goddesses whose mouths pour blessing without losing any. Steps up from the east softened the transition from street to sacred. In the west and south, fire halls built near water learned to hold light without smoke. In the center of the land, basalt allowed a sanctuary whose proportions made even a skeptic walk slower. Between c. 300 and 550 CE, squinches, pillars with pot and foliage at the top, and mouldings in crisp rhythms took their places. The sculptures along the base told the town its own stories, women at wells, men counting fish, dancers turning anger into discipline, so that even those who did not enter knew what was kept within. Crafts that had earned their coin in markets earned memory in sanctuaries. Jewelers who had traded with captains in pepper towns now cast lamps whose wick cups curved like a swan's throat. Ivory cutters moved from combs and dice to railings and panel inlay that turned a king's chamber into a forest where birds never startle. Dyers who had watched cloth darken at the edge of a tank learned to lay colors in fresco so that a wrist's blue vein could be seen under paint. Carpentry's grammar shaped chariots and doors with the same honesty about grain. Bronze ran into lamps and bells that marked hours and kept prayers from getting lost. A black stone, when oiled and garlanded, taught the hand that veneration begins in touch. Even coins asked to be handsome. In the West during the first 2 centuries CE, the faces of kings looked left and right with a confidence that bought pepper as well as pride, and the reverse bore a goddess seated or standing with cornucopia, reminding buyers that portrait and harvest are a single economy. The city became theatre even when no play was scheduled. A procession taught geometry to alleys, a festival taught color to balconies, a wedding taught rhythm to a ward. Courts of justice learned to time silence, markets learned to orchestrate shouts. Even a funerary raft on a river after dusk, the lamps drifting like pebbled stars, taught a neighborhood what proportion looks like when grief holds it. Dancers who had stretched in courtyards at dawn learned to hold whole stories in the arc of an arm and the swerve of a neck. Singers who had read scriptures with straight backs learned to bend phrases until sweetness met clarity without either being damaged. Manuals spoke frankly of desire and of restraint, naming tastes and postures and perfumes and chiding gluttony with the ease of an aunt. Other manuals spoke of polity and justice as if writing about irrigation: cut here, line there, let flow where it must, restrain where it should, and measure twice before allowing the floodgate to rise. These books were not shy about their ambition, to create citizens the way a sculptor creates a lintel, by patience and by rule. The gods accepted these attentions with the modesty of presences that have seen many ages. A blue-black cowherd stood in a painted grove where flute and peacock shed a feather's logic. a lord with matted hair and a crescent taught a town to love ash because it tells the truth about time. A goddess in a red sari lifted a hand to quell fear and another to give, while in her eye something older than the city watched. Monasteries received endowments and returned calm, caring for travelers, beasts, and widows with the same lists and ledgers that merchants used. Ascetics leaned on staffs in courtyards where judges had earlier leaned on arguments, and the two gave each other a nod without mockery. The stupa remained a hill refined, a place where the living could circle the dead until sorrow broke its own wheel and rolled away. The temple remained a box for the breath of the town, a place where hunger and gratitude could be owned in public without embarrassment. Art put brave faces on new patrons as well. A Kushan king around the turn of the 2nd century CE allowed his robe to be shown in stone with foreign folds and his title to be struck in scripts that spoke across caravan leagues. A Gupta sovereign in the 4th to 5th centuries CE asked that his coins show a goddess feeding the earth with right-hand abundance, and his pillars asked that grammar and grace coincide. Merchants chose to have their mothers' names cut on cave pillars because piety is sweetest when filial. Guilds asked that their marks appear on railings, not only for credit but to teach apprentices that wealth serves reputation, not the other way around. By the early 5th century CE, a seated teacher in fine sandstone at a deer park near a great river returned the favor of patronage with a serenity that trained generations, and a boar lifting the earth from waters at a sacred hill made politics look small next to rescue. Music and dance created communities across language. In ports where amphorae bumped against jars of ghee, sailors learned choruses that could be sung with a deckhand from another sea. In courts where disputes over weights had been settled at noon, the evening's ragas settled disputes within the chest. In the south, where hill temples taste wind like a fruit, a drum pattern kept the mind awake through ritual and allowed even cynics to admire the discipline that joy demands. Theatres used curtains as honest devices, the world taken down and put up before the audience's eyes, and nobody minded the trick because the day's commerce had already taught them that all value is made in public. A hand gesture representing a fish could appear in a harbor at dawn and on a stage at dusk, uniting labor and leisure in a single sign. Even as beauty grew local accents, it learned to speak across frontiers. Travelers from far empires stood under lion crown pillars and traced letters with their fingers. Emissaries who had known the taste of wines from other winters admired gateways whose brackets nested like swallows under an eave. Eastern monks returning from long roads brought back sutras written in cloud tracts and asked craftsmen to house them in boxes fit for gods. Pepper paid for altars. Gold from foreigners bought mango groves whose fruit then fed monasteries. A ship's captain endowed a well at a pass because he had learned the hard way that water is the only universal currency. Thus the chorus of architecture, image, story, and song reached a poise that the land could call its own. The wheel on railings echoed the wheel of law, the lion became not a threat but a witness, the flute taught patience to petitioners, the conch that once frightened a wall now blessed a threshold. Cities put on their best faces without lying about their work, and villages found their delight reflected without being patronized. All this grace, however, did not float free, it stood on a platform of order and ambition. Kings funded gateways because roads needed justification, merchants paid for caves because caravans needed safe valleys, poets were fed because a realm that has put down rebellion must next put down boredom. From these causes emerged the peaks that tradition counts when it speaks of a country's apogee, the first great canopy of law from 322 to 185 BCE, the broad markets and foreign styles of the 1st to 2nd centuries CE, the classical hush of the 4th to 5th centuries CE. The patrons have names: Chandragupta and Ashoka, Kanishk, Samudragupta, and the rivals who forced excellence have names as well: kings beyond the mountains who once took tribute from Gandhara, a youth from the west who tested elephants at a rain-swollen river, traders with coins of Rome who taught the coast what perfection in weight feels like. Their shadows draw long across the galleries and the shrines, and the tale now moves from the housed flame of culture to the tall fires of expansion and encounter, to the mornings when banners crowded the horizon and an empire's outline could be read from a hill at dawn. The canopy spread first along the rivers and then across the stony back of the land until the sea blinked in 3 directions. In 322 to 297 BCE, a young conqueror with famine still in his memory and stubbornness in his jaw gathered Magadha's cords into his fist and set out to make one drumbeat serve 1,000 villages. Garrison by garrison, ford by ford, Chandragupta stitched the north into obedience and persuaded the west to peace. Between 305 and 303 BCE he balanced war and treaty with a lord from beyond the passes, took elephants in exchange for quiet, and set mileposts where rumor had once been the only guide. He seated governors where once only local pride had sat. He planted couriers and spies along roads from Patalipitra to Taxila like a line of torches that did not wait for darkness. He paid the army and the officials in time enough to show that justice can be punctual as well as stern. When he grew old and the hunger of conquest gave way to the responsibility of custody, the machine ran on grain, coin, and the habit of obedience, and his son who kept it oiled, c. 297 to 273 BCE, turned eyes toward the Deccan where basalt steps remember thunder and pepper's roots hold the scent of rain. Then came a king who read his reflection in blood and did not look away. Ashoka took the reins c. 268 BCE, and in 261 BCE he drove them east and south into Kalinga, where the rivers flatten and meet the ocean under a sun that holds a city to account. The beaches after the taking were crowded with the stillness of those who should have been walking. The paddies reflected a sky that had no answer. Even the victorious were lean with disgust at themselves. From that hour he made power kneel to conscience without unstringing the empire. Between 259 and 232 BCE he set lions atop polished pillars that held sentences instead of flags. He told his officers to count mercy among the expenditures of state. He sent men with bowls and doctrine along roads wider than a caravan to teach moderation in killing and faithfulness in speech. He ordered wells and shade trees planted by the mile so that even a stranger, walking at noon, could bless a crown whether or not he knew its name. The canopy of law became visible in stone and audible in the even voice of officers who had been told that a prisoner is not carrion. And yet the arm that had built all this remained muscled, elephants drilled, frontiers were watched, the treasury breathed like a great creature in sleep. Strength, newly instructed, came to prefer the clean victory of restraint. After 232 BCE the great umbrella began to fold section by section, not from a storm alone but from the many little breezes that take advantage of a summer evening. In the north the Yugas, c. 185 to 73 BCE, held what they could with cavalry that loved dust and ritual that loved clarity. After them the canvas kept a kernel warm. Westward the sea's wind carried other names ashore and through the passes, 2nd to 1st centuries BCE saw Greeks with winter in their bones, Soccers who had ridden long behind their flocks, Parthians whose arrows preferred the backhand shot. They did not arrive as a single wave, they lapped and receded, set up satrapies along routes that caravans would have made sacred if trade were a religion, minted silver with tidy brows on one face and emblems on the other, and learned from the towns they held that a port's patience is a better friend than a fort's pride. On the plateau and along the Godavari and Krishna, the Stavhanas, c. 1st century BCE, 2nd century CE, mastered the logic of rivers and tanks, drawing a belt of towns from sea to sea, making pepper a taxable virtue, cotton a caravan's heartbeat, and pledges a form of engineering. Far to the northwest, a people that knew both glacier light and desert wind raised a kingdom out of crossroads. The Kushans gathered fragments into a bright circle between c. 50 and 200 CE, under Kanishk, c. 127 to 150 CE, the capital by the stone gate of the north, Purushapura, filled with speech that could order both cavalry and councils, and coins that spoke in two tongues passed through hands that prayed at many shrines without apology. Cataphracts in gilded skin trod the frontier and met infantry whose spears came out of fields paid for by steady taxes, caravans hauled silk thin as an eyelid and sutras rolled like precious cloth, monasteries in the valleys learned to count in two currencies, grain in the courtyard bins and the quiet of minds trained to stillness. From Mathura to the passes the figures of compassion stood with shoulders that remembered warmth and eyes that remembered snow, and the land learned that borders can be places where styles keep each other honest. All this traffic wrote an account that could be balanced only by a poet king with a head for weights. Around 320 CE the Guptas took Pataliputra's long raft of a city back into their keeping and set the north in order with a gentleness that had steel under it. Samudragupta, c. 335 to 375 CE, moved like a careful fire, through the Ganga's middle and down toward the forests, up to the old Kuru Panchala country and out to the edges. He bowed some, bound others, burned a few, and allowed many to remain themselves under his shade in exchange for tribute and courtesy. On a pillar by the Yamuna the list of humbled and befriended read like the genealogy of a continent's political weather, monarchs riparian and inland, hill chiefs and coastal lords, island kings who sent gifts over chop and swell, and forest peoples whose names tasted of bamboo and rain, so that a reader could see not merely conquest but choreography. His gold coin showed him plucking a lute as if to declare that a hand taught to measure melody can measure mercy. After him, Chandragupta II, c. 375 to 415 CE, widened the arc to the west, pressing upon cities whose coins had carried square letters and straight faces. Ujjain took on the gravity of a western capital, and trade bells rang along routes that made pepper into poetry and gemstones into policy. The bow on his coin did not lie, and the goddess beside him promised abundance without smugness. Under this classical hush, c. 320 to 480 CE, the land achieved a cooperation between wealth and beauty that made both less ashamed of themselves. In Bharat and Sankai earlier, the stone had learned to tell stories. In Ajanta now, 5th century CE, the stone learned to hold color and silence at once, and courts and guilds together paid for walls where compassion and kingcraft could admire one another without jealousy. Temples found a grammar at Deogar, c. early 6th century, where a sanctum learned to draw breath from a tower and a threshold learned to keep the world outside without insulting it. In the plains a column of iron, raised perhaps around the 4th to 5th century and resisting the spite of weather with an obstinacy that felt like virtue, spoke without words about skill made humble by purpose. Universities of the spirit in the middle Ganga, where monks and laymen could sit on the same stone under a tree and separate ignorance from grief, took endowments from kings and boatmen alike, and a road's dust was balanced by a classroom's quiet. But the horizon never remains empty merely because we wish it to. After c. 55 CE, from the north where wind is a knife and from the west where horse lines draw themselves on the steppe, the Ha came under leaders whose names rang on steel, Toramana first, then Mihirakula between c. 502 and 542 CE. They tested the northern plains with a ferocity that made cities remember how to be prey. Taxala's old stones felt again the insult of fire. Temples and monasteries learned that memory is sometimes the only property a building can keep. Gupta power, once a river swollen with many tributaries, ran in thinner channels. Provinces discovered their own thrones behind their own gates. Coin grew lighter. Petitions were answered with promises that took too long to ripen. In Malwa around c. 528 CE, a king of restrained ambition, Yashodaman, shouldered Mihirakula back and raised a boast on stone as sharp as his victory. But boasts cannot be minted into a currency that lasts centuries without other coin behind them. The canopy that had sheltered scholars and shipmasters, dancers and judges, farmers and road gangers began to fray at the edges, and the middle showed bright patches where local hands patched it for love or necessity. Even before the horsemen shaved the edges of empire, other long winds had shifted. In the 3rd century the far western empire that had paid in gold for pepper and cloth began to breathe irregularly, and the coast learned to count silver more carefully and to marry its daughters to prudence as well as to hope. Ports adapted, as ports do, teaching their boys new names for customers and their pilots new lines of foam, but the flood of foreign coin that had once rung in temple bells became a thinner chime in the marketplace. Inland, endowments turned local, landlords who had once been officers became petty kings by any other name, obligations multiplied into little knots that a central hand could no longer untie in a single gesture. The elephant, when asked for campaign, was more often promised than delivered. The roads were kept, but some milestones leaned. The law still spoke, but more softly, and more often in the tone of compromise than of command. Yet the apogee remained unmistakable in memory and in stone. A traveller in c. 410 CE could step from a ferry at Prayaga and read victories on a pillar that had already supported earlier boasts, then walk south and see a temple whose door frames told the story of gods and of the city's own women drawing water. He could journey west to Ujjain and find a market where coins from 2 seas bought dyes and stories. He could move north and see monasteries where students argued without anger through the hour when the light turns brass. He could turn east and find a capital where the courtyard smelled of ink and ghee and iron and where judgments were spoken in prose clean enough to drink. And he could stand on a hill in the early 5th century and watch banners lift like birds at dawn, some with the discus and conch, some with the trident and drum, some with the lion and wheel, and know that for a sustained while the land had balanced grain and grammar, spear and scripture, drum and abacus, so well that even envy had to applaud. Names lit that balance. Chandragupta, 322 to 297 BCE, who raised timber palisades and made couriers run on time. Ashoka, 268 to 232 BCE, who made remorse a public office and mercy a state expense. Kanishk, c. 127 to 150 CE, who told two frontiers to face each other without breaking the glass between them. Samudragupta, c. 335 to 375 CE, who turned war into an audit and lenience into policy. Chandragupta II, c. 375 to 415 CE, who taught the West that the bow and the coin can shake hands. Skandagupta, c. 455 to 467 CE, who stood at the first cold edge of the storm and held it a moment longer than anyone had a right to expect. Around them stood ministers who could measure a canal's loss and a court's patience, artisans who could throw a pot thin enough to need only wrist strength and carve a beam with a memory of forests, captains who knew when to stop a victorious pursuit because the ground ahead was treacherous, poets who could make a king's duty taste sweet in a citizen's mouth. This was the high noon the land remembers when it names its own possibilities. From 322 BCE to 185 BCE, the first great canopy. From c. 50 to 200 CE, the frontiers cosmopolitan harvest. From c. 320 to 480 CE, the classical repose in which law and lyric shared a bench. Ships stitched the coasts to the mouths of the Nile and the gulfs beyond. Roads braided tanks and towns into an inland sea of exchange. Iron and ink stood side by side in the day's work. The wheel carved on railings echoed the wheel of order. Lions became witnesses instead of hunters. The conch that had frightened a wall became a courtroom's bell. The banner that had gathered an army became the canopy over a festival. The land knew itself as Brata in those years not merely because songs said so, but because a man could walk for a month and know, from the way a drain was kept and a price announced and a judgment delivered and a shrine's lamp trimmed, that he had not left a country but crossed a province. And yet noon carries the secret of afternoon within its brilliance. On the northern horizon dust rose where riders practiced cruelty as if it were a craft. On the western routes the old patrons of pepper stumbled and new buyers arrived with different tempers. In the heartland the gold in the coin thinned and the coin itself became more shy. Governors learned to love local loyalties too much. Temples drew wealth into stone that could not march. Monasteries that had been fed by many now relied on fewer hands. After c. for 80 CE the map wrinkled. After c. 500 to 550 CE it creased and tore, and after CR 600 the pieces had names rich with pride but shorter in reach. What remained constant was the ledger of habit and hope. The language is thick with memory, the rites that keep grief from becoming rage, the pillars that still speak when rain has done talking, the roads that remember the discipline of the drum and the hand that pays the toll fairly. The grandeur gathered itself, as all grandeur must, into legacy, into the scripts that taught a continent to write, into the gods who learned new faces without forgetting their old, into the laws that even a conqueror learns if he wishes to be obeyed after he is gone, and into the songs that make field work feel like worship. The banners would fray, the coins grow pale, the officers change their titles, and yet the country would continue under other crowns and in other accents, carrying forward what heights had fashioned, so that in the seasons we shall now enter, when thunderheads gather at unfamiliar edges and long-established lamps flicker in an unexpected gust, c. 500 to 650 CE. We will still know what is being lost and why it can never be wholly taken. Afternoon sloped into evening and names that had sounded together began to sound apart. After for 80 CE the gold thinned in the coin and the promises thinned in the hall, governors learned the sweetness of local applause. A province measured itself by its own river rather than by the far city's drum. From the northwest came riders whose hooves wrote arguments in dust. Toramana pressed upon the plains in the early 6th century and Mihirakula between c. 502 and 542 CE rode the winter wind into cities that had thought stone a guarantee. Taxila's old schools felt fire, monasteries bowed, rose, and bowed again. A court that had once heard verse in the morning heard hoofbeats at noon. Cold left in a hurry after c. 528 CE when Yashodharman of Malwa met the storm and forced it back, and the pillar he raised remembered victory with clean lines, but pillars can only say what men have already done, and the canopy that once stretched from the edge of salt deserts to the mangrove mouths now showed separations like hairline cracks after heat and rain. In the gap where empire had stood, a king of measured appetite drew a circle with his patience. From Thanissar to the Ganga elbow and out toward the old western roads, Harsha held a realm from 606 to 647 CE with a hand that liked to sign grants as well as orders. He moved his seat to Kannauj, a city that knows how to drink river light, and there he kept clerks who wrote neat, captains who did not over-explain defeat, and envoys who could compare laws without losing temper. He asked that hermit and householder each be given his due, that pilgrims be timed by kindness rather than suspicion, that monasteries be fed so that doctrine could outlast weather. Along the Yamuna and the middle Ganga, courtyards again smelled of ghee and ink. At Nalanda by c. 500 to 650 CE the long benches kept their discipline through rains, and a bell marked the hours for men learning to separate grief from error. He fought when the map refused to be quiet, and he forgave when a rival wore down into a neighbor. When he died in 647, the cords he had gathered slackened as cords do when the hand is gone. While the north rehearsed unity and relinquished it, the plateau and the coasts learned to make sovereignty speak in regional accents. In Badomi the Chalukyas took basalt in hand around 543 CE and taught it to be door and cave. Their kings stamped coins that satisfied both market and pride, and their armies held the passes where granite makes a man honest. Pulakeshin too, whose years ran c. 610 to 642 CE, met Harsha on the Namadhar about 618 to 619 and made the river a treaty. The north would look to the Ganga, the south to the Godavari and Krishna, and each would remember that a boundary can be a way of breathing rather than a wound. Eastward and southward the Pallavas at Kankai, their stature rising notably in the 6th to 8th centuries, carved shores where the sea drinks stone. Their scribes liked clean letters and their masons liked to turn monolith into ship and shrine. When war came, it spoke with familiar brevity and new skill. About 642 CE Narasimhavarman I took Vatapi and sent the news home with a sobriety that made even enemies nod, victories recorded in rock-cut mandapas and in the hum of new markets. The quarrel between Deccan and coast taught architecture to stand tall and to bend. At Aihole and Patadakal in the 7th and early 8th centuries, towers rose that argued in two languages at once, curving spires that loved the sky and tiered roofs that loved balance, so that a traveler could see in one courtyard the conversation of a peninsula. along the Kaveri and at the edge of the surf by Mahabalipuram in the later 7th century. Shrines came out of the cliff with lions at their knees and waves at their doors. The Kailasanatha at Kankai taught stone how to cradle shadow. The Badomi caves learned to hold a drumbeat without echo losing the tune. South again in the red soils where kings measured time by tanks and harvests, the Pandyas kept pearl and polity together. Farther west and north, the ports of Pepper read a quieter script of endurance between c. 550 and 750 CE, adjusting to foreigners who now came with different coins and a different pace, and to neighbors whose demands could be met only with patience and a better road. Trade did not go out when large crowns dimmed, it learned smaller lights. The monsoon still kept its appointment, or still counted the swell between June and September and returned with northeast winds when the paddies were in. Ships stitched the western creeks to gulfs where amphory had grown rarer since the 3rd century. The gold that had once rung in temple bells now came in thinner streams and often as re-minted memories. In the east, boats from Tamralipti and the lower mouths of the rivers made their way to Cloud Islands where rice is stored against the hour and to long coastlines where scripts and images were ready to learn. Letters travelled by sail, copying themselves on palm and stone far from the hands that first bent them. Merchants who had learned to stamp contracts with seals now taught coastal markets overseas to trust the curve of a letter and the weight of a promise. Pepper paid for chapels abroad, sandalwood paid for halls where stories would be told under other stars in voices that kept faith with their source. The law of the land rearranged its benches without losing its seat. Grants became local charters with precise boundaries, field by field, bund by bund, cut into copperplate and hung from the beam of a town hall. A tank's schedule was written into rights and the rights into genealogy. Villages held assemblies with heavier responsibilities and, sometimes, heavier hands. Great estates grew in river belts where a wise ruler traded central reach for steady cultivation. Headmen recorded who owed labor to the bund and who owed coin at the gate. In many places from c. 600 onward, officers bore new titles, little kings under larger ones, lords by adoption rather than by myth, yet the same old tests remained. Was the drain cleared by the first rain of Ha? Did the ferry run at dawn the day after a flood? Did a widow receive her share with as little fuss as the law demands and courtesy improves? Even as crowns altered, the city kept faith with making. In Ujjain through the 5th to 7th centuries, observers set nomans and listened to the shadow, calendars tightened their cords, treatises used numbers that admitted of nothingness without shame, allowing a clerk to write what had not been owed as elegantly as what had. In the south, furnaces refined steel that took an edge like conscience and a polish like water. In the middle river plains, silk replaced some of the vanished gold as the luxury of note, and cotton continued to turn sweat into modest comfort across caste and craft. Music grew new rooms, dance found fresh steps for old tales in temples whose pillars remembered war in their reliefs and blessed its distance. Poets at courts in the 6th and 7th centuries, northern, western, southern, praised kings with a clarity that allowed advice to hide inside compliment, and dramas played to houses that contained both judges and sailors. The languages under the large umbrella now stepped into sunlight with their own pride. Tamil had long since named love and war precisely. Kannada took measured speech into inscription. Prakrit and the later Sanskrit of courts did not quarrel but traded favors, the one for each, the other for polish. Not all departures were caused by men. Rivers turned a little or a lot, embankments held 1 decade and taught humility the next, a locust year visited one province and not its neighbor, the sea took a market and returned it 2 generations later in a different cove. A storm will read no charter, yet habit held. Guilds extended credit when rains cheated, shrines opened kitchens when grain failed, granaries shuttered for pride found their locks tested by anger and then by the slow shame of counsel. A country that has lived long with flood and drought can make a hierarchy of mercy, it can tell a king how much to forgive without making a market lazy, it can tell a headman how much to insist without breaking a widow's back. In such seasons, doctrine and custom proved themselves not in disputation but in the rice pot and by the ferry. Buddhist halls and Brahmanical sanctuaries both adjusted their lamps. The great university on the Ganga plain, whose cloisters were thick with rain and debate from the 5th to the 7th century, received endowments from men of many crowns. Stupas were replastered and painted where caravans could still be counted, monasteries sent learned feet along roads leading east and across water, carrying rolls where compassion had been written in tight lines and images of calm whose faces learned new light on other coasts. Shrines to the gods of river, mountain, and storm grew tall near town gates and inside them sanctums grew dark, a darkness kept on purpose so that one flame could count. The wild lord with the crescent received new houses of stone between c. 600 and 700 in the south and west. The preserver lay on the serpent of time in sanctums where the air tasted of camphor and dust. The goddess stood with a hand raised to quiet fear and another open to donate, and she gathered to herself the offerings of markets that still learn generosity by ledger. Processions kept their orderly noise, festivals kept their function of making strangers kin at least for a night. The reasons for the long afternoon are the reasons a house ages. Wars stretched a treasury thin and forced the coin to lie about its hunger. Smart men accepted local thrones when they could not find promotion at a distant court. A frontier that had once been the nation's pride became 3 or 4 people's problem. An office split into 2 and the second office learned to enjoy independence. Even a temple, built for permanence, could gather wealth until that wealth became a kind of immobility. Even a monastery, built for compassion, could depend on patrons whose fortunes followed the wind. No single act undid the North's old span, a braid loosened strand by strand between c. 80 and 650 CE until it wore as many ribbons as there were rivers. And yet continuity stood where fashion wavered. Children learned their letters on soft palm with the same strokes that had once marched along pillars, a clerk's neat numeral some tax in a village that had never heard the name of the last empire, a boat slid under a bridge whose repairs had been paid for by a guild founded before any living man's grandfather, a drummer beat the same 3 calls at dawn, market, court, shrine, and men came by habit whether or not the prince was in residence. Varna still provided a vocabulary for duty, jati a grammar of daily trade and marriage, disputes still wound their way from doorstep to ward to the bench, and a fair judge still built a reputation slower than rumor and longer lasting than panic. The calendar brought lamps on a certain distant night and water fights on a certain hot afternoon, and the old songs pleased even those who had learned new tongues. The legacy lay not in a single monument but in the way the land knew to begin again. Scripts that had been lines on Ashoka's polished stone became families of letters across provinces and across seas, teaching strangers to keep books and to swear without swords. The meter that had carried hymns learned to carry drama and epigram. The old mythic bodies, boar and lion man, blue herdsman, an ashby-smeared dancer, river goddess and speech lady, stood wherever men and women asked for courage or release and found themselves answered by forms already known to their grandparents. The law that had once clenched the empire at the waist diffused into 1,000 fair habits, the fairy's right to a fee that is not theft, the widow's right to a small share that is not charity, the apprentice's right to be taught as well as used, the tenant's right to the canal's water on the day assigned, the cow's right to live out her strength. The discipline that had once moved elephants beneath banners moved jars of grain into the kitchens of the poor when rain failed, and moved jars of oil into the lamps of shrines and schools so that a night of hunger did not also become a night of ignorance. Commerce made its own testament, wheels wear grooves that outlast disappointments, milestones lean but remain legible, customs dues noted in a clerk's tight hand remind men that fairness is a policy and not only a virtue. The sea kept the coastline honest with profits and with loss, the pepper vines taught patience, the cotton fields taught that the extraordinary depends on the ordinary. The furnaces of the south, the forges of the center, the looms of the east, all three multiplied a competence that does not need heralds. Temples kept their bells on time, stupas kept their shade, market squares kept their geometry. The children of earlier treaties became the unwritten treaties of later streets. So the great span from 3300 to 1900 BCE in brick and drain, from 1500 to 600 BCE in hymn and herd, from 600 to 200 BCE in council and coin, from 322 to 185 BCE in the first canopy, from c. 50 to 200 CE in frontier harvests, from c. 320 to 480 CE in classical hush, and from 480 to 650 CE in twilight and resilience, resolves into a country that never undid itself entirely. Some cities slept and were not waked, others learned new names and kept their wells. Some doctrines took ship and ripened elsewhere, others deepened their roots and drew water for new shoots. Empires broke on rivers and mended on roads, banners frayed and were rewoven as festival canopies, kings promised and failed and were replaced by men who promised again. Through it all the monsoon returned, late or early but never absent for long, the Indus still turned its mouths to the sea, the Ganga and Yamuna still braided fog and light in winter, the Godavari and Krishna still unrolled their ladders of sand, the Kaveri still counted tanks like beads. Oxen leaned forward, women balanced water on their hips, a boy learned the curve of a letter that would feed him his whole life, a judge listened longer than anger, a potter's wheel took breath at dawn and turned. And under every step the earth kept the ledger. A seal pressed with a bull claimed an old man's thumbprint in fields sown by his descendants, a weight of stone sat right in the hand of a child who did not know it had once purchased a voyage, a pillar's lion watched the seasons gnaw and pass and did not forget the sentences cut into its skin. Beads surfaced after rain in the furrow of a later age, a ring well's mouth still tasted sweet when a new city rose, a fragment of polished ware taught a girl the pleasure of perfection, a flake of steel kept its edge under three owners. The past here did not end, it stored itself, like grain in a jar sunk to its shoulder in a cool floor, waiting for the day when hunger or hope would ask for it. Thus their fall was a way of continuing, and their legacy was the ability to become plural without becoming lost, the capacity to call the land Brata not because one crown demands the word, but because 1,000 small accuracies, of ritual and road, of shelter and sail, of mercy and measure, make a country feel like a single house with many rooms. If a traveler in a later century were to kneel in the dust where a city had been and pick up a small square of fired clay with a unicorn leaning under a staff, if he were to follow a road where a lion still guards a sentence and arrive at a tank lined by the generosity of men whose names a pillar remembers, if he were to stand in a hall cut from rock where color still keeps the faces of compassion from sleep, if he were to watch a procession carry a lamp into the darkness of a sanctum and hear a drum count the very same beats that once timed a march, he would know that the story was not a line but a braid. It begins in water and ends in water, it rises in brick and returns in brick, it sings in verse and then in law and then again in verse, and its gods and its merchants and its armies and its monks share the same roads and the same rain. The land endures by remembering the useful and forgiving the proud, it hands to each age a kit of habits and a book of images. And so the last word of that ancient history is not an ending but a competence, to harvest after flood, to rebuild after fire, to reconcile after conquest, to teach after forgetting, and to see, in the shine of a well or the weight of a coin or the cool of a pillar at noon, the continuous mind of a country that has learned how to last.